Ms. Oppen, if you'll do the TV coverage announcement and the roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The special hearing of May 4th, 2009 will be televised live on County Santa Barbara Television, CSB TV, Channel 20 at 9 o'clock a.m. in the South Coast, Lompoc, San Ynez Valley, Santa Maria, and Orchid areas. Rebroadcast of this special hearing will be on Wednesday, May 6th, 2009 at 5 o'clock p.m., Thursday, May 7th, 2009 at 9 o'clock a.m., Friday, May 8th, 2009 at 9 o'clock a.m., and Saturday, May 9th, 2009, and Sunday, May 10th, 2009 at 5 o'clock p.m. on CSB TV, Channel 20. And for the roll call, Commissioner Cooney,
Here.
Commissioner Brown,
Good morning, here.
Commissioner Brooks,
Here.
Commissioner Valencia,
Here.
Commissioner Blau.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, this is the time that we allow for public comment for any item not on today's agenda. So it'd be anything other than the community plan for Santa Ynez. So Commissioner Cooney, do we have any speaker slips?
I believe these are for the matter on the agenda.
Okay,
Mr.
great.
Chair.
Seeing none in the audience? Fine. Ms. Oppen, if you'll read the first item in the record, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The following is the hearing on the request of the Planning and Development Department to consider case numbers 09-GPA1, 09-GPA2, 09-RZN7, and 09-ORD10, and to recommend that the Board of Supervisors amend the Santa Barbara County Comprehensive Plan through adoption of the San Ynez Valley Community Plan, which entails specific map and text amendments to the land use element and circulation element of the Santa Barbara County Comprehensive Plan, and map and text amendments to the Land Use and Development Code, Chapter 35, zoning of the Santa Barbara County Code, and certified the San Ynez Valley Community Plan Final EIR 08 EIR 4 as adequate environmental review for case number 09-GPA1, 09-GPA2, 09-RZN7, and 09-ORD10 pursuant to the state guidelines for implementation of CEQA.
Thank you. And just to kind of put everybody on notice, it was the plan to have the staff report done today. And depending upon the amount of time it takes to do that staff report, if we have any time for public comment, we will do that. But there is some concern that we might not. We have scheduled all day Wednesday in Solvang to take public comment. However, if there is anybody in the audience that wishes to make public comment that is not able to attend the meeting or doesn't intend to attend the meeting on Wednesday, I'd like you to please note that on your speaker slip, and we will make every effort to get your comments in today.
And Mr. Chair, when you say Wednesday, you mean Wednesday, May 13th.
Thank you. Wednesday, May 13th, yes. Yeah, this Wednesday is another different hearing. That's correct. So with that, Ms. Black, do we have a staff report?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have quite a few people from Long Range Planning here today to
I assume
present this item to
Mr.
you.
Johnson, Derek, you're going to start?
Yes, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission, thank you for having us today. I think today is an exciting moment in the kind of the history of the San Ynez Community Plan process, which has been going on for a number of years. Of course, today is the first of 4 scheduled hearings with the Planning Commission to consider and receive a staff report and public input in order to forward a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors regarding the initiated plan and certification of the proposed final EIR. We have a team here today, including myself. We have County Counsel, Mr. Ed Gates, who's been working on the project for the last year and a half or so on the EIR. We have Justin Feek to my right, who has been the project planner, who's been working hand in hand with Rincon Consultants on the preparation of that EIR. We have Mr. Brian Tetley, who is a recent addition to our office and very much welcomed, and he has a rich and a long history working on actual current planning projects within the valley. He is very familiar with a lot of the issues on a block-by-block basis. Behind me, I have Mr. Rob Mulane. He is with Rincon Consultants, and he was the principal in charge of working on the EIR. And then just directly behind me, Mr. John Jostis, who is the Independent Environmental Coordinator. Today's presentation by this staff is the staff that's really handled the EIR portion of this particular project. There have been numerous staff, as if you look in the actual community plan itself, who have worked on the plan over a number of years. Many of the staff have moved on. We have plowed through the administrative record of both the GPAC and the VPAC to try to glean, should the commission ask any questions about kind of the legislative and administrative history behind some of the policies that have been brought before you. We'll try to answer those questions. But fortunately, we have two chairpersons who are here, one from the GPAC and one from the VPAC, Mr. Bob Field from the VPAC and Lansing Duncan, former planning commissioner and chair of the GPAC. So if there's any questions that the commission has that staff can't necessarily address related to, well, what was the particular reason why these sites were chosen or the particular policy nuances, staff's got a pretty good handle on those questions, as we've had to really dig into that in the course of looking at the EIR, but there may be questions that the commission may want to address to those two folks who came here today. We may have, along the course of the meetings, members of either folks who served on the GPAC or the VPAC, or also the Valley Blueprint. You can see there's a long history where people have engaged in this planning process. So today, the staff report and the EIR that comes before you represents over 17,000 hours of staff time that have been spent on this particular planning effort. A little close to almost $2 million that the county has spent advancing the plan to this point. So certainly this is a very significant milestone in the path of this particular project. Now moving to the role of the Environmental Independent Coordinator. That is a particular position that is required under the county CEQA guidelines. And the Environmental Coordinator is appointed by the County Executive Officer. And their role, Mr. Joseph's role in particular, is to ensure the preparation of the EIR by the department complies with the requirements of CEQA and the CEQA guidelines. And he plays that role, working hand in hand to make sure that, since our department also drafted the particular policy, wanted to make sure as well that there's some objective analysis of the impacts related to the proposed policies. We also have, of course, County Council, who looks at that document in length to make sure that it also complies with CEQA. Mr. Joseph is here to answer any questions if you have any particular issues with the project description or any aspects of the EIR. Getting back to the overall hearing schedule, we of course have 4 hearings scheduled. I'm just going to walk you through just a couple of the key timelines. We released the EIR back to the public back on March 27th. We wanted to make sure that that document was on the street for a considerable amount of time before today's hearing, so that there was ample time for people to review our response to comments. As was reported in, I think, a memo that's provided to the commission today, we went to SB-CAG on the 16th, and the plan was found consistent with the airport land use plan by that commission. Today's first hearing, we have the hearing next Wednesday on the 13th at the Solvang Veterans Hall. That meeting starts at 9 a.m. Then we transition a couple weeks to the meeting on the 3rd, and then we are looking at our 4th meeting on the 29th. We've got some room here. There's been some requests by the community to try to look at not having some meetings during the summer break time. And should the commission make your final decision on the 29th to forward it to the board, we would use this time period to make any changes to the community plan before we bring it to the board, which is tentatively scheduled in September. And if it takes 2 hearings, we would look at anticipated we would have certification and approval of the EIR as soon as October. In terms of your planning commission packet, it included the staff report and discussion of the initiated project description, including attachments F, G, and H, which is the staff recommendation. Plus, we provided the commission also with making a recommendation to forward the initiated plan with the heritage sites overlay, and those attachments are found in C, D, and E. The packet also contains the appropriate resolutions to make the modifications to both the general plan land use elements and the circulation elements. And as mentioned, there's an ordinance associated with each one of those. Of course, the packet also includes the initiated plan by the Board of Supervisors back in September of 2006 and the proposed final EIR. One of the points that we wanted to make as part of our presentation, because I think when we listened to the comments and received the comments both at the hearing on the EIR as well as looking at the comments that were submitted, was there seemed to be some level of confusion about the relationship about the community plan and the EIR. Of course, on your left is the community plan initiated by the board in September 2006. And here's the EIR that was prepared to analyze that particular plan. The EIR does not, in fact, replace the community plan. It is simply a required aspect under the law to study that plan, to look at the environmental impacts associated with that policy framework. There is, of course, a feedback mechanism in that the EIR proposes a series of mitigations, which in some cases modify the development standards or policies or action steps to strengthen those particular issues related to environmental impacts. I thought it was important to clear that up. There seemed to be some sense that this document was now usurping this one, and that's certainly not the case. This document also, under CEQA guidelines, will serve as a master environmental assessment looking into the future. And that's important for you as decision makers looking at current projects out in the 5, 10, 15, 20-year time horizon, because you can look at this document for what is the regional and cumulative impacts and what is the regional setting and how do the particular projects fit into the analysis that we did on this overall plan. In terms of today's discussion, I'm going to start with a presentation of the kind of the brief background of the history, the development of the community plan, talk about the plan, following really the order of how the plan is structured, beginning with community development, segueing into public facilities and development resources and constraints. Then I'm going to touch upon some of the cumulative impacts, some of the alternatives that we discussed, and then other CEQA requirements. And then we'll conclude and adjourn this meeting to the May 13th session and talk about what are the next step, any follow items that the commission may have that you would like some research on, and we can get back to you certainly. There are going to be natural breaks along the way, and depending on how the commission wants to proceed today, based upon the chair's direction, certainly there's going to be times where it'd be natural for the commission to have any questions about any topical areas. So jumping into kind of the background, the Valley Blueprint process began back in 1998. It was eventually released in 2000 and represents the vision of over 40 residents. The blueprint offers a vision of what the Valley would like to see in terms of outcomes and issues related to quality of life. The blueprint served as a roadmap and guide for the GPAC and the VPAC as it began the development of the San Ynez Community Plan and as the VPAC looked to refine the plan in 2005. The GPAC began its work in 2001. It was a diverse group of community members appointed by the 3rd District. They held 32 meetings in the Valley to discuss a wide range of issues, the typical issues that you would see on a PAC agenda related to land use and public services, visual resources, agricultural tourism, wineries, circulation and highways. So there was certainly a robust discussion that happened over the course of those 32 meetings. Eventually, they were able to move forward a plan that went to the Board of Supervisors back in 2004, which was initiated for environmental review, and they essentially completed the bulk of their work. In 2005, the GPAC was replaced by a new appointed Valley Planning Advisory Committee. One of the first actions of the board after the VPAC was appointed was to reduce the planning area from 231,000 acres to 46,000 acres due to concerns related to the large amount of lands with primary rural land uses being mixed in with urban land uses. The concern of the larger planning area was related to urban policies and the larger expanses of the rural area. The VPAC held over 24 meetings and worked to clarify and augment the work previously done by the GPAC. Much of the VPAC's work focused on framing issues for environmental review, selecting some sites for the downzone alternative, refining mixed-use overlay, and coming up with the proposed heritage sites overlay. The VPAC completed their work back in May of 2006, and they forwarded their plan to the Board of Supervisors, who made some modifications to that plan based upon some meetings that they held in the Valley, and eventually, as I've mentioned, they initiated that plan back in September 2006. Now focusing your attention on the environmental review process, what has staff been doing since September 2006? Once the board initiated the plan, staff went through a process of selecting Rincon consultants and an independent coordinator, preparing the team. We released the notice of preparation back in July of 2007. We held a hearing in the Valley to receive comments from the public on how we should proceed and what were the issues to focus on in the course of preparing the final EIR. During that hearing, as we did later in the comment period on the EIR, there was a request to extend the time frame on the comment on the NOP. We extended that beyond the 30-day requirement to a full 75 days, and we closed the comment period on October 3rd, 2007. The comments that were received on the NOP are included in the FEIR for your review. Beginning from there, from October 2007 till just June 2008, we prepared, I think, what I would believe to characterize as the most comprehensive environmental document in the Santa Ynez Valley. We released that document in early June. We held a hearing in the Valley where we received verbal comments, and the comments typically focused on a request by the Valley residents to extend the timeline for the review of that document. They felt that, I think we had offered 60 days on the original document, and we eventually extended that time frame to 105 days. The comment period closed on November 22nd, 2008, and then from there we proceeded to respond to the over 350 pages of comments, 700 individual comments on the draft EIR, and that's where we got to where we are today in the spring of releasing that proposed final environmental impact report. Now switching to the actual plan, and so today's presentation is going to be, we're going to cover the policies first. What are the main policies that staff felt were important to bring to the attention of the commission, and then they're followed by what we believe to be the salient and important environmental impacts that were identified in the proposed final EIR. As you can imagine, trying to boil down and condense the over 1,200 pages of EIR in addition to the policies proved challenging, so the commission certainly may have questions about some of the policies that we don't cover in today's presentation. In terms of thinking about the actual planning area, I think it's important to recognize that there's essentially three distinct areas. And you have the urban townships of Santa Ynez, Los Olivos, and Ballard. Those are the urban areas. We have the inner rural area, which is the area between the urban boundary and the rural boundary. And this is somewhat different, I think, in the rest of the county, where usually the urban and rural boundary are often coterminous, and there isn't this interrural area. So this is for some of the planners and some people who follow planning in detail, just looking at and thinking about the valley in a little different way is somewhat challenging to apply the interrural area to our policy environment. And of course, we have then the rural area. The map above shows these particular land use regions within the planning area. The urban boundary is it's pink on the slides, but it's essentially the township of Santa Ynez, Ballard, Los Olivos, and we have a smidgen of other urban areas that are spread throughout the area. Then between the urban boundary and this green line is the interrural area. And then outside of the green line is the rural area. And then this dashed line that surrounds the whole area is the community plan boundaries. Well, how does that break down in terms of overall planning area? The pie chart above basically shows that just under half of the area is rural, followed by less than a third of the area as interrural. EDRNs make up the third highest area, followed by the urban areas, with the largest being the township of Santa Ynez, then Los Olivos, and then Ballard, and so on. The analytical approach that we took in preparing the final EIR looked at really what is the plan build out over a 20-year horizon. And the 20-year build out was used as a basis for developing the project description, since it typically represents the outmost length between comprehensive updates of community plans. The county has recently, I think, had a very good track record of preparing community plan updates in a roughly 12 to 15 year time frame. And the build-out analysis over the 20-year time period looking back, and we looked at data back over, I think it was 20-year time horizon. We looked at what was the most aggressive and highest period of growth, which is actually the last 5 years, in trying to project what the build-out would be. And you can see as really what this plan is, which is a plan to preserve the status quo of the Santa Ynez Valley, that the delta or the difference between the existing community plan and existing comp plan and the initiated plan is fairly small. You see a slight increase in the number of secondary units. Of course, the affordable housing overlay provides some opportunities for affordable housing, which brings in additional 76 units. So there's 187 potential additional units beyond what's allowed under the comprehensive plan today. Our analysis revealed, and based upon what we believe which will happen in the valley, is we'll see less commercial as a result of the mixed-use overlay, and we'll see a preponderance of residential uses versus commercial uses within those respective townships. So what is the goal of the Santa Ynez plan? I think this is the pillar goal, and I think that this is going to resonate throughout the presentation. The goal is to maintain the Santa Ynez Valley's rural character, its agricultural tradition, while accommodating some well-planned growth within the township boundaries that is compatible with the surrounding uses. And this is really the key cornerstone goal that really drove the later policy decisions that are made in each section of the document. The plan contains some overall policies that implement that pillar goal. There are policies, of course, that distinguish and differentiate the urban boundary lines and what is allowed within the urban boundaries within the Santa Ynez, Los Olivos, and Ballard areas. And the urban boundaries represent the maximum extent of the urban areas within the Santa Ynez Valley. There is also a policy that has brought some questions and comments during the course of releasing the EIR, which are related to annexations by either cities or by other governments. And there was a policy that was put into the document and by the Board of Supervisors at that September 26th meeting that essentially said that the county was concerned about losing jurisdictional authority over land that was either annexed to another jurisdiction or by another government. And basically there's a policy statement that the county shall oppose that loss of that jurisdiction should any government agency propose such an action. Township goals and policies. The goals are to promote a mix of development opportunities within the townships of San Ynez, Los Olivos, and Ballard. The goals promote development of housing, which is affordable to area residents through the proposed mixed-use overlay and the affordable housing overlays. And I'm going to go into great detail into the aspects of those key overlays as part of today's presentation. Another primary goal is to maintain and enhance the vitality of those areas by making sure that the scenic quality, the historic character, and rural architectural style of the townships remain a high priority. Maintaining a sense of place, maintaining a rural heritage tradition within those townships was a very, very important driver in coming up with the policy framework in the San Ynez Community Plan. Adding on to some of the township policies, and again, these are just some of the highlight policies that we found to be important, is working in concert with the housing element. The plan encourages a provision of mixed affordable units on parcels within the plan area. In particular, the mixed-use overlay provides for a reduction in parking and improve site design while maintaining the site area's pedestrian character and ensuring that future development is consistent with historic development patterns in the area. Within the mixed-use overlay, and again I'll talk about that in detail, all projects would be subject to design review by the Board of Architecture. And we actually have, as part of the plan, there is an action item, and we've put that forward as part of our work program effort to develop township-specific guidelines for Ballard, Los Olivos, and San Ynez. Now switching your attention to the rural goals and policies, due to the different land use densities and development characteristics within the rural area, the plan includes specific goals and policies germane to the rural areas of the plan. The primary goal within the rural area is to protect and support agricultural land use and encourage appropriate agricultural expansion. Also, new development shall be compatible with adjacent agricultural lands, and the plan contains several tools which include EDRNs, heritage sites that will work to protect agriculture. These tools will, again, I'm going to talk about those later in today's presentation. The plan also promotes opportunities for agricultural tourism, such activities will promote and support the primary use of land as agriculture without creating conflicts on site with adjacent agriculture production. So what were the findings overall related to, in the EIR related to some of the land use policies? The EIR concluded that there would be no significant land use related impacts resulting from the implementation of the plan. There were some Class 1 impacts overall, but those same Class 1 impacts would have been realized without the adoption of the plan itself. There are some Class 2 significant impact, but mitigatable impacts related to affordable housing sites, A and B, which will be discussed later. And I think overall, the conclusion of this plan is that the plan does have many beneficial impacts related to the plan build out and rezones, because essentially what it does is it takes the existing build out that's allowed today into the comprehensive plan and puts on top of it policies, development standards, programs, and action items, which largely will mitigate the impacts related to that future growth. Now moving on to the mixed-use overlay. I'm going to start off and first talk about the mixed-use overlay within the township of Santa Ynez. And the mixed-use overlay is applied to 71 C2 zone parcels within the township of Santa Ynez, totaling approximately 32 acres. The mixed-use overlay applies to, only can be used within the urban areas within the Santa Ynez Valley. It applies to just the base zone of C1 and C2. So as all typically overlays do, they either relax or provide additional standards related to the base zone district. Now moving over to Los Olivos, which is the other urban area that's proposed to have the mixed-use overlay. In this area, it would apply to 73 parcels, zone C2, for a total of 21 acres. Within the areas of all the overlay districts within this overlay district, since it provides an incentive for both residential and commercial uses. As part of that overlay, there is a restriction on the types of uses that ultimately could be incompatible with that dominant residential use. I'll just give you a couple examples: frozen food lockers, service stations, storage warehouses, contractor equipment storage, dry cleaners. And so as the base zone district would allow these types of uses, this overlay restricts those uses because it's trying to encourage that mixed-use development. The goal of these particular overlay is to generate additional opportunities for infill housing, maintain the pedestrian-oriented character of the Old Town areas, reduce regulatory barriers to mixed-use development. It provides, and I'll talk about it in a minute, some residential units by right development. Now switching to what are the actual requirements and what is allowed. Residential use equal to or greater than 25% of the gross floor area shall be allowed under the base zone district. That's essentially by right development. That's the intent of the overlay. Gross residential development shall not exceed 66%. I think there was concern while trying to encourage mixed use within the urban areas to not have it become a use that displaced the commercial uses within the respective townships. Residential uses from 25 to 50% are allowed with the minor CUP, and 51 to 66% are allowed with the major conditional use permit. And ground floor, the ground floor that faces the primary public street frontage within this district must remain commercial. Coupled with that incentive is an affordable housing requirement that 25% of the residential units shall be rented to very low or low income households that meet the county affordability criteria. I think this particular policy was largely a result of the Valley looking at the last RHNA cycle, the 2003 to 2008 cycle. They were faced at looking at potential sites within the Valley and really not wanting to lose a lot of either the sites that might be appropriate for affordable housing, losing the agricultural uses that were on those, or putting densities on vacant lands that may be inconsistent with some of the adjacent properties or may have aesthetic or visual conflicts. So the strategy was one of coming up with the affordable housing sites, which are proposed as part of the plan, but also in concert with that, looking at encouraging and requiring affordability as part of mixed-use development. Should you come in with a project that results in a fractional unit, since the number of units that you can build is based upon, or bedrooms that you can build is based upon the amount of commercial square footage. So let's say you have 2,500 square feet, and you're allowed 2 bedrooms per 1,000 square feet. If you end up with a fractional amount, and in this case it would be 4.25, you can actually, the second bullet relates to feeing out and paying the in lieu fee of that amount in terms of the affordability requirement. In terms of development standards, is as typical as you see within these old townships. They're the setbacks. No front setback is required, and this is again trying to bring those uses really close to the street edge, trying to create that pedestrian environment. Parking. In terms of parking, we're going to be looking eventually at a comprehensive parking analysis within the respective townships, but it allows for a 50% reduction of the number of parking spaces that's required for the commercial uses. The parking requirements are the same for the residential uses. And the review authority, whether it's the zoning officer or the planning commission, can have the authority to reduce or modify and waive those particular parking requirements if particular findings can be made. And those findings are, one, that there's a shared parking agreement for possible, it could be conjunctive use. You have two businesses that decide to get together, and one has operations in the morning, one has one in the evenings, and there's an agreement that county council has found acceptable and has brought forward as part of your review of that particular project. Another finding can be made that the parcel's configuration doesn't allow for the driveway access from the rear or side and would require the installation of a driveway along pedestrian stretch of the sidewalk. Again, we want to try to make sure that there's a continuous stretch of sidewalk so we encourage pedestrian walking when people come to these historic townships. Or you also can make the finding that there's adequate parking exists on the street or in public parking lots within the mixed-use overlay district. And that would require a specific parking study to demonstrate, in fact, that on-street capacity or public parking lot exists. What did the EIR conclude about the mixed-use overlay? It concluded that it would contribute to Class 1 significant impacts related to public services, particularly fire protection, and potential Class 1 impacts related to cultural resources, impacts on significant historical and archaeological resources. The mixed-use overlay would have beneficial impacts to hydrology and water quality and long-term hydrological impacts. So in particular, I think one we didn't mention on here as well, and this is kind of key to the air quality discussion that we're going to make down the road, is certainly from the Attorney General's perspective, as they're looking at general plans throughout the state of California, mixed-use development, compact infill development is something that the Attorney General is really looking at to reduce vehicle miles traveled and trying to reduce GHGs to try to put people in places where they live next to commercial areas. In terms of the mitigation that came out of that analysis is that a new fire station would need to be built within Los Olivos. There were additional standards that were required, and this standard that I'm citing here, I think this is Development Standard 2, was part of our SB 18 consultation with the tribe, where the county committed to using the best available resources when looking and identifying potential impacts to archaeological resources within the planning area. I talk about the SB 18 consultations later down the road, but the Chumash tribe was very instrumental in coming up with a very robust planning tool looking out to make sure that impacts to cultural resources are in fact mitigated. Additionally, the last bullet, making sure that the mixed-use overlay encourages development in the township that preserves the integrity of the historic resources. And this is, as projects start to come forward and take advantage of these new incentives under the overlay, it's going to be important down the road that the county implement one of the action items, which is to develop these township-specific guidelines, so the Board of Architectural Review and you as commissioners have a standard and something to be able to look at to hold designs to. Now switching over to the affordable housing sites overlay. The affordable housing sites overlay applies to 4 sites that were selected by the Valley Planning Advisory Committee. It promotes the development and provision of affordable housing, as it does within other areas within the unincorporated areas of the county of Santa Barbara. In order to take advantage of that particular overlay, projects need to have a minimum of 30% of the units need to be available for very low households, or 50% of the units are available to a mix of affordable households. And this particular overlay is not a requirement. You don't have to build the particular units. The property owner has the option of either, if they come in with a development proposal, to build it under the base density they have today, or if they want to take advantage of the overlay and the incentives related to affordable housing, then they have to meet specific performance standards. Now, bringing your attention to, well, how are the 4 sites ultimately selected? And there was a process that that was initiated by the VPAC, and to look at 6 potential sites within the area. There was, in 2005, community groups that included Preservation of Santa Ynez, Preservation of Los Olivos, Friends of Santa Ynez Valley, and other groups that are very interested in land use issues, formed a subcommittee and came back with some criterion related to the selection of sites. And the criterion that was forwarded was one of availability of wastewater services, so it needed to be adjacent to an area where it can either be annexed or was within an existing district that could have municipal wastewater services, since wastewater is an issue in the valley. One where it was not on prime ag lands, where it had a strong relationship to commercial areas within the valley, where it was along transit corridors, where there was not the potential for higher conflict of those denser uses with adjacent densities and land uses. So there was some, and I think one of the other points is also no impact to agricultural resources. They didn't want to put affordable housing or come up with sites that look to displace active farming or future potential farming within the valley. Out of the 6 sites that I just provided to you, that I think that were considered in 2005 by the VPAC, ultimately these 4 sites were forwarded as part of the initiated plan, and out of the 6 that were shown on the last map. This map that's on the screen comes out of the EIR, and it shows the locations of the 4 affordable housing sites, but particularly sites A and B. It is important to note that AHOD sites A and B bisected the Santa Ynez Valley Airport approach zone, which is depicted by this red line. And there were some mitigation measures that came out of that analysis and were ultimately brought forward to the Airport Land Use Commission, and any future projects that come in that want to take advantage of those particular densities will need to make sure that they follow the mitigation measures. The project description that we put forward, or that was forwarded by the VPAC and by the board, eventually looked at a potential of 115 affordable units on the 4 sites. But as I just mentioned, 2 of the sites, A and B, that were found to have potential conflicts with the airport, as a result of the mitigation measures which push the development envelopes for the affordability outside of the approach zone, reduced the number of units on site A and B, which resulted in a decrease from 115 potential affordable units out of those 4 sites down to 76. Just now walking you through each one of those particular sites. Site A is currently zoned commercial highway and residential 1.01E1, and with the overlay, would be rezoned to C2 with an affordable housing overlay of Res 20, DR 20. And that applies to both A and B. Affordable housing sites C and D are being rezoned from Res 1.0 1E1 with affordable housing overlay of Res, is it 12? DR 12. So you can, on C and D, we've got a potential of 24 and 26 units compared to the other one. So you can see there's actual bigger development envelopes on C and D, which have a smaller of a density on those sites relative to the DR 20.
Commissioner Brown has a question.
Mr. Johnson, would you just explain why E and F were eliminated?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Brown, in looking through the records, it wasn't clear, wasn't apparent from the minutes about how the 4 sites were selected compared to the other 2. It appears from the minutes and the presentation that the criterion that I provided was used as a vetting tool by the VPAC to whittle it down to the 4 sites.
I'm going to have that same question. Maybe at a subsequent meeting, you can come back with a greater explanation of why we're not considering those other 2 sites.
The mitigation measures that were imposed upon by the Airport Land Use Commission, and this took some work on behalf of staff to come up with the mitigation measures. One requires the Airport Land Use Commission to review and approve the future development within the approach zone. Number 2, an navigation easement is required for any development on AHOD sites A and B within that approach zone. And number 3, which is to state the development of the densities under the affordable housing shall not be located in the airport approach zone. Again, so moving those higher residential land uses out of the approach zone and putting them closer to Highway 246. Other impacts that were found related to B and D in particular, A and C have residential buildings on them that are greater than 50 years old and therefore under CEQA could be deemed to be historic. Demolition of those particular buildings could have significant change in the setting or integrity of those the buildings if they were in fact to remain. Application of the development standards within the plan and mitigation would allow these sites to be treated and be reviewed under CEQA and county standards and guidelines. And I think it's important for the commission to understand that because with the recent review of the housing element, the affordable housing overlay sites are not by right development as such were the sites that were selected in ORCUD. Still, the commission has a tremendous amount of review looking out into the future to take a look at these projects, in particular the develop and apply development standards and policies to them as appropriate.
Yeah. I have 2 questions for you. Probably both be answered later, but any provision for moving historic sites? I mean, that's quite often you can preserve them by moving them to a more retail location. And the second is why we're looking at a DR 12 for an affordable housing site as opposed to a DR 20. Just need to know the reason that they made that recommendation because it seems foreign to me. The state's coming along and telling us that we've got to zone at 20 units per acre. So why are we doing it 12 for an affordable unit? I'm sure you'll have the answer later.
I can answer your first question now, Mr. Chair, which is certainly CEQA looks to avoidance first in impacts related to historic structures, and if avoidance cannot be achieved, then relocation is certainly an option under CEQA in order to preserve that historic building or resource within the site. Now switching to the third overlay within the valley, which is a key policy feature which is intended to reduce visual and aesthetic impacts to the valley as a result of the build-out anticipated over the 20-year time horizon. As undeveloped and underdeveloped areas become more urbanized, or there is additional areas within the rural area, new development is intermixed with existing development, and the quaint historic character of the townships could be impacted, and the design overlay is a mechanism and means to ensure design review to make sure that those aesthetic and visual impacts are minimized. In addition, the design overlay is applied to areas throughout the planning area, and the new areas are shown in kind of a lighter green on your map. It doesn't really show up too well. There's some existing design overlays above the hill out here. There's some above as you come in on Refugio Road to the south of the San Ynez Townships. The design overlay is an existing tool within the Land Use Development Code and is already in use throughout the county. It requires design for all new development and certain improvements or alterations to be reviewed, in this case by the Central Board of Architectural Review. In the valley today, the design overlay encompasses 65 parcels totaling 584 acres. The plan proposes to apply the D overlay to an additional 154 parcels and an additional 6,005 acres. So for a total of 6,589 acres under the plan area, which would be covered by that overlay if you added the new areas. What is the purpose, as I mentioned, is to make sure that these areas, because of visual resources or unique neighborhood characteristics, that new and altered structures are subject to design review. All that review occurs in compliance with current sections that are already articulated in the county's Land Use Development Code. And not only do the structures need to comply with any design standards that are formulated and added to the Land Use Development Code that are just general in nature. Were we to come up with specific design guidelines, they would need to comply with those as well, in addition to the regulations of the base zone district. The EIR concluded that the D-design overlay and the expansion would have beneficial impacts, Class 4 impacts, in terms of long-term compatibility conflicts related to minimizing also the visual character changes and impacts to the valley. It also has the ability to reduce the potential for alteration to scenic views. We do have a scenic highway, a state-designated scenic highway that runs through the planning area. In particular, the potential for design review and really the proposed outdoor lighting ordinance, which is a key feature of the plan package as well. It also will reduce the increased light and glare as a result of new development, both within the townships and also within the rural areas. I believe there was a letter that was submitted by the university, and they're planning on putting a telescope out there in the Sedgwick Preserve, and they're very concerned about additional light coming in the valley and the impact on that particular facility. Also, the D-design overlay concluded that potential agricultural urban conflicts could be minimized as a result of these design guidelines as well. Heritage site overlay. The heritage site overlay was selected in the project description by the VPAC and the Board of Supervisors and applied to parcels in the valley whose potential subdivision requires a higher level of scrutiny and careful consideration to ensure that several community objectives are met. The community objectives are preserving the rural aesthetic of the valley and township, gateway areas, maintaining separation between the townships and providing compatibility in lot size with neighboring parcels. The overlay has been placed on selected parcels whose location, visibility, or other characteristic make them pivotal in maintaining the valley's rural character. The heritage sites designation, should the Planning Commission and the board decide not to select the downzone alternative, would not occur because the downzone option would achieve the central goals and objectives of the heritage sites overlay. The purpose of that district, again, designating those parcels where potential subdivision requires a higher level of scrutiny and careful consideration. The objectives are to preserve the rural aesthetic, maintain separation between townships, and then providing compatibility in lot size with neighboring parcels. A total of 52 parcels with over 2,363 acres were selected and proposed as part of the initiated plan to contain that overlay. The EIR concluded that there would be Class 4 beneficial impacts related to the proposed overlay, and it has the benefit of preserving the rural aesthetic and maintaining the separation between the urban areas, making sure that the aesthetic impacts of the gateway areas are maintained, and providing for the potential for compatibility in lot sizes with neighboring parcels. There were no adverse impacts that were identified as a result of the overlay. Rather, again, the heritage site overlay may have beneficial impacts on maintaining the rural character and advancing some of the primary goals within the plan.
Just one short question. Was there any special notification by mail or otherwise of the owners of those sites that that's downzone was going to occur as a result of this plan?
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, as we've developed this plan over the last 9 years, we've developed a very extensive database of people who have followed this plan. I think there's over 900 people on our email list. So we sent emails to them. We've put notices in the paper, and then everyone who was going to be rezoned, whether it was the D design overlay, the heritage site overlay, mixed use overlay, received a mailed notice by the County of Santa Barbara of these hearings.
Well, of the hearings or of the change, I'm going to need a copy of that notification because I'm concerned that bit of property owner just got a rezoning on something out in the city and got no notification there, but I wasn't real happy. So I want to make sure that all the owners that where these changes occurred, that they got specific notice of the change and what the change means.
Mr. Chair, we'll be happy to provide you a copy of that notice, and we worked with council to make sure that it comported with the standards under the law to make sure that it was clear that the county had proposed zoning actions related to their property.
Thank you.
Now switching attention to the proposed downzone alternative, and this is staff's recommendation, and the downzone alternative was ultimately recommended by the VPAC to study in the environmental impact report. And in staff, in looking at and conducting our analysis, we certainly wrestled with our recommendation on down zones and the policy choices and implications related to downshifting any particular property owner's potential ability to subdivide that property. I think was a tough discussion for the GPAC, for the VPAC, and it certainly was a tough recommendation for staff to make, recognizing that in some cases there may be non-conforming lots that are created, and non-conforming structures potentially, and we wanted, recognizing that property owners sometimes have economic expectations in those properties, understanding that our recommendation to your commission, and should you forward that recommendation to the board, certainly may have implications beyond just the policy framework looking out. Nonetheless, I think the downzone alternative represented a compromise by the VPAC in light of the preferred policy option, which was the heritage sites overlay, which was the first mechanism to look at preventing the subdivision of those properties within that were identified in the inner rural and rural areas. The proposed down zone alternative that was asked by staff, by the VPAC and the board to study, looked at changes in land use designations and zoning for 119 parcels in the rural area. It had a full theoretical build-out reduction in the number of primary units by 172. It would, of course, preclude further subdivision of those properties. It would reduce VMT and the total amount of average daily trips by 841 trips per day. And as the table in the alternative section discusses, there would be incremental reductions in wastewater, water, and solid waste impacts. But it's important to note that in the case of any of the Class 1 impacts that were identified in the EIR, the down zone alternative did not bring those down to Class 2 levels. It's very incremental in nature, in size and scope. But in looking at staff's recommendation and looking at the primary goal that I spent some time on talking about earlier, staff felt that the down zone alternative more readily addressed that goal. In summary, what is the policy aspects of the down zone alternative? In general, several properties that are currently Ag 1.5 and Ag 1.10 would be rezoned to Ag 120 and Ag 240. A number of properties zoned Ag 120 would be rezoned to Ag 240 and Ag 2100. The alternative would, again, eliminate the further subdivision of these parcels and would reduce the amount of residential growth expected in the down zone areas.
Just another question. You said a minute ago that in doing this, you're going to create non-conforming parcels. Maybe you could explain that a little further. I mean, are you telling me that there's a 5-acre parcel out there now that may be vacant, and if we rezone it to 10, they can't build any house on there, or are we having that doesn't make sense to me, so explain what we're doing.
Mr. Chair and members of the commission, in some cases, the down zone alternative may be rezoning or redesignating a parcel that would be non-conforming as to size if it were to be redesignated. And that certainly does not limit the ability of someone to develop that parcel. The county's land use development code does allow, and there are quite a number, and I'm going to talk about the numbers as part of the presentation, existing non-conforming lots within the planning area. If you have a non-conforming lot as to size, you can still build your units, you can still take advantage of most all of the development, I think all the development that's allowed under the land use development code. You simply can't subdivide that lot anymore. And I think council's prepared to field any additional questions should the commission have any questions about the legal issues associated with that action.
Does council want to pipe in on that comment? I think Mr. Brown, I'm hearing, wants a little explanation. I think I would too.
Mr. Chair, I think Mr. Johnson has described essentially the dynamic. Right now, down zones don't necessarily affect in the long run, or I shouldn't say, let me rephrase that. As far as down zoning, the county will, in this document, is going to propose down zoning as part of this alternative. I'm sorry, it's not proposing, but as part of this alternative. This process doesn't necessarily reduce anybody's entitlements on their current lots. It does change the permitted uses on certain lots, and it does inhibit the ability in the future, as Mr. Johnson said, to subdivide property. Is there Mr. Chair, was there a more specific question you had for me?
I guess I'm not sure I understand why you would want to create a non-conforming parcel. I mean, we have difficulty all the time with projects that come before us where that's the case, and I'm not sure why you would do that. Why you would take an existing parcel that's a 5-acre parcel and zone it to be a 20-acre parcel is the minimum parcel size. I don't get the logic behind that. Maybe you can help me.
Well, as far as the policy concerns, I think Mr. Johnson's going to have to address that. Are you asking what is our authority to do so?
What's the benefit? I don't understand the benefit of doing that.
Mr. Chair, I think the history behind this is that in some cases there were existing parcels that were together with other parcels that had potential subdivision. In order to make sure that there was consistent zoning and land use designations within a particular area, and there might be lots that were smaller than those surrounding lots, they were lumped in together with the other lots that were going to be downzoned so that there would be consistent zoning and land use within that particular region.
Commissioner Brown.
I think in order, I don't know how the rest of the commission feels, but for me, in order for me to understand the policy and how it affects the parcels that you're considering, it would be helpful to do kind of a walkthrough of each of these. I don't know the total number or if it's doable, but it might be good to get an understanding of that in light of your discussion about how these parcels would match other parcels in the area, and just so that we can get a better handle around this. I can look at maps all day long, but it's easier when there's someone talking about it to bring forth.
If I had a bigger map that identified the non-conforming parcels that this
Yeah.
creates, that would be helpful to
That
me.
might be too.
Yeah,
And
Mr.
so
Chair,
I'll delay any more questions until I get that, and we can go through it.
and yeah, we could certainly give you
Okay.
an amplified presentation at the beginning of
And-
next
and-
meeting.
And I'm also concerned about Mr. Yates' comment that there may be some other restrictions or difficulties in developing that property with the zone change. If we could clearly identify those, it'd be helpful as well.
We'll go ahead and clarify that at the next meeting. The following map that doesn't show as well as it does in the printed out version, so just my suggestion to the commission would be to follow along with that map, shows the parcelization within the San Ynez Valley that occurred from 1970 to 2004. The green areas, which are shown in the map, shows the parcelization that occurred during 1970s. You can see it's a little darker in hue. And then if I go to the next slide, it then starts to show the subdivision that occurred from 1980 to 1990. And then clicking again, you see the further subdivision that started to take place from 1990 to 2000. And then the last click shows the subdivision that has taken place, that is proposed to take place from 2000 to 2009. So you can see that there's been a fair amount of parcelization that's incurred since the 1970. And of course, that was all allowed under the county's land use element. So these property owners were simply just taking advantage of the subdivision potential that was allowed under the county's land use environment and allowed under the land use development code. The map on slide 55 shows the zoning and boundary changes under the proposed project description. The map also highlights areas that would change under the downzone alternative and a comparison of the rural boundary under both the project description and the staff recommended downzone alternative. Starting with the planned boundary line, which is shown again in the dotted line that surrounds the area. The red line shows the rural boundary under the project description. You can kind of follow that along. You can see it's fairly bright. The blue line, which deviates in some locations, shows locations where the downzone alternative and the project description the rural boundary line changes. You can see where certain parcels are moved from the inner rural area and put out into the rural area. And that, of course, those boundary changes are made as a result of putting those rezones and land use designations that would be proposed as part of the down zone alternative, putting them in areas where those parcel sizes would be more appropriate. And then lastly, there's a green line that shows where the existing rural boundary differs under the project description. So again, in some places, the project description proposes a rural boundary that's different than it is today. The next map shows zoning and boundary changes under the down zone alternative. The map also highlights areas that would change under the down zone alternative and a comparison of the rural boundary under both the project description and staff recommended down zone. So you can see it doesn't really show up too great here on the map here because it's in a lighter pink color, but you can see that there's parcels, which I'm going to go into greater detail, that are there along here, some to the south of the planning area, on the gateway areas as you come in, that show the down zone and then the associated change in the rural boundary. The following map shows the reduction in units by parcel under the down zone alternative at the full theoretical build-out. The down zone alternative would result in 119 rezones, as I mentioned previously, and a reduction of 172 primary units at full theoretical build-out. Using the build-out data from 2002 to 2007, when full theoretical build-out would actually occur, we estimated that you would get to the 172 the total units for approximately 47 years based upon the historic build rates within the planning area. So now focusing your attention on where is the unit reduction based upon the down zone. You can see as you come in on Highway 246 and 154, this kind of a triangle, you can see there's a significant amount of reduction. Some to the south of the townships areas, to the north of the city of Solvang, a little bit to the south of Buellton. As you leave Buellton, going west towards Lompoc, a proposed rezone and land use designation to the north of Los Olivos. So you can see there's the alternative that was identified by the VPAC to be studied really targeted and looked at parcels where there was the potential for subdivision that would create potential conflicts with surrounding land uses and create potential incompatibility, particularly with agricultural uses. Now bringing your attention to the build-out table, we now have added a new line which shows the potential build-out over a 20-year time horizon with the down zone alternative. And you can see there's a slight reduction in the number of primary units over that time frame. We believe it would be 20 units less over a 20-year time horizon compared to the 172 over a full theoretical. There's 111 units less of secondary residential units. And that's primarily related to the elimination, the ability to build RSUs. As you put particular parcels within new zone districts, you're not allowed to have an RSU as part of the underlying base zone district. So it would eliminate the ability to have those secondary uses and units. So at the end of the day, we would see we believe over a 20-year time horizon, a net reduction of 131 units within the planning area should the commission decide to forward that recommendation to the Board of Supervisors. Now getting to Mr. Blau's questions and the commission's questions about non-conforming lots. Out of the 119 parcels that would be rezoned as the down zone alternative, today we already have 39 parcels that are currently non-conforming as to lot size. the downzone alternative zoning, 85 parcels would be non-conforming as to lot size under the downzone alternative. And I think, as I mentioned before, parcels that would be downzoned and be non-conforming as to lot size would still have the ability to renovate, rebuild their homes, build new homes in the event of disaster or et cetera. So they would still be afforded all the opportunities as a property owner that has a conforming lot size, but certainly at a subsequent meeting, we'll walk the commission through the particular aspects of the land use development code, and we'll also provide you with a map as to what 85 lots we're talking about and what are the 39 lots that exist today.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I can continue with the presentation?
Actually, I
or-
think this is a good time. We're going to take a short break, 10 minutes or so, and we'll start back again at 10:30.
Thank you, Dan. Question.
We'll do that, yes. Okay, I think we're ready to go back on the record, and before I start, for those of you that may have gotten here late, since I was asked a question by a couple of people, we are going to attempt to provide an opportunity for anyone that wants to speak when the presentation is done. However, I've asked that if you're going to be at the meeting in Solvang on the 13th, you may want to hold your questions and comments till then. It's my preference to try and give those people that aren't able to make that meeting the opportunity to make public comment. So that being said, and I think Mr. Yates is going to expand upon an earlier answer on the question of the downsized parcels and their ability to.
Well, there seemed to be a couple of questions there, and we were discussing those. And one seemed to be, are there any different permitted uses going from Ag 1 to Ag 2? And yeah, there are a couple. One of those, as Ms. Black pointed out, is she believes there's a change in second residential units where they're not allowed in Ag 2 or Ag 1.
Mr. Chair and members of the commission, residential second units are not allowed in Ag 140 or any Ag 2 zone districts. So to the extent that somebody had a piece of property that was zoned Ag 120 or below and was being rezoned to Ag 140 or Ag 2, residential second units would not be a permissible use for those properties. And I think there may be a few other uses that I was going to look up as your commission continues today.
Another question was possibly regarding nonconforming uses, which Mr. Johnson addressed briefly, and where you have an existing structure and it's downzone and it becomes nonconforming, you can rebuild, but only in the same footprint. You cannot expand the footprint of a nonconforming structure either through a rebuild or when it's even when it's destroyed by a natural disaster. You still are limited to the existing footprint. There's a specific ratio for disasters on rebuilds. I don't know the exact expansion, but there is a slight expansion you can take after a disaster. As far as non-conforming lots, you would still be able to build a residence, a primary residence on a non-conforming lot.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Johnson, do you wish to continue your presentation then?
Yes, Mr. Chair. So now moving the commission and public's attention to an overview of the EDRNs. And this is, I think, one area that we want to spend a significant amount of time, and we've got some maps that are juxtaposed to each other that really show what is being proposed in terms of changes to the EDRNs, both under the initiated plan and also under the proposed downzone alternative that we studied under the direction of the VBAC and the board. First off, start on what is an EDRN. It is an existing developed rural neighborhood. It's a boundary line and land use element similar to the urban boundary or rural boundary. The EDRNs is an area that has been historically developed with lots smaller than those found on the surrounding rural and interrural lands. The purpose of the EDRNs is to prevent these pockets of smaller rural residential development from spreading onto adjacent agricultural land. Changes proposed by the community plan would eliminate undeveloped single lot EDRNs under the downzone alternative, and then create several new EDRNs, mostly through redrawing of the rural boundary. Now focusing your attention on the overall plan and areas of the EDRNs. The existing EDRNs are shown in green, shown in gray. Proposed additions to EDRNs are shown in purple, and the new EDRNs are shown in green. And existing single parcel EDRNs, we have two of them, one located to the east of Santa Ynez and one to the north of Los Olivos, are shown in orange. There are 6 existing designated EDRNs within the Santa Ynez Valley, totaling 4,671 acres, or 10% of the plan area. The following slides, as I mentioned, will review the proposed EDRNs in the initiated draft plan and in the downzone alternative. The first EDRN is just that I'm going to be describing, and these numbers follow the EDRN numbering convention that was found in the plan. The first one is number 1, which is just north of Highway 246. It is located a third of a mile west of the city limits of Buellton, and it has historically developed with parcel sizes smaller than the surrounding Ag 2 100 parcels. The land use designation in this area is Ag 240, and zoned Ag is 10 AG under Ordinance 661. Under the current 10-acre minimum lot size, subdivision is possible on 4 of the properties, potentially resulting in 4 additional lots. The initiation draft plan recommends changing the land use designation with the new EDRN from Ag 240 to Ag 110, and zoning from 10 AG to AG 110. The downzone alternative also recommends defining this area as an EDRN, but would exclude 2 of the southern parcels from the EDRN, and they would be rezoned from 10 AG to Ag 240. The EDRN number 2, immediately west to the urban boundary of the city of Buellton, is an existing ranchette neighborhood in the inner rural area, is comprised of 18 parcels, predominantly zoned Ag 15. No zoning or rural boundary changes are proposed in this area under the plan or the downzone alternative. The initiation draft plan recommends moving the rural boundary to the east, coterminous with the city of Buellton city limits, and applying the EDRN boundary around the ranchette neighborhood. Again, no zone changes within the new EDRN are proposed. The third EDRN is an existing EDRN referred to as Bobcat Springs, and there are no boundary changes proposed under the initiated plan and downzone alternative for the Bobcat Springs EDRN. Now moving your attention to EDRN number 4, which is shown, and just to help the commission understand these slides. So on the left, we've got what is proposed under the initiated plan. On the right, we have what is proposed under the downzone alternative, and the map legend kind of helps you understand what's happening in each scenario with the rural boundary and with the EDRN designation and the related changes in land use designations and zoning. In number 4, the Ballard EDRN, there are no changes proposed to the existing EDRN. And number 5, both the initiation draft plan and the downzone alternative recommend creating this new West Los Olivos Ranchette EDRN, moving the rural boundary east towards Los Olivos would necessitate defining the neighborhood as an EDRN, since it consists of smaller lots, residential uses surrounded by the larger agricultural uses. The EDRN is comprised of 22 parcels, most of which are 19 to 20 acre rural residential parcels with an Ag 120 designation totaling 369 acres. Now moving to EDRN number 6, the Figueroa Mountain EDRN is one of 2 existing single parcel EDRNs within the planning area. The 85-acre parcel is zoned Ag 120 and is currently used for grazing. The initiation draft plan would retain the existing EDRN designation and the Ag 120 zoning for the parcel. However, the downzone alternative proposes to remove the EDRN boundary designation since a single parcel EDRN does not technically meet the definition of an existing rural neighborhood, and the parcel would be rezoned from Ag 2 100 consistent with the surrounding uses. So you can see there's no shift in the rural boundary. It simply just stays where it is, but you pull away the zoning and the single EDRN designation. EDRN number 7, both the initiation draft and the downzone alternative recommend adding 30 vacant parcels. And these are these parcels that are shown in the darker purple to the existing Woodstock Oak Trails EDRN. 22 parcels within that have no subdivision potential in the west and central area, and those are the ones that I mentioned are part of the 30 that are to be added. All would have a land use designation of Ag 120. The plan would also adjust the rural boundary in the south east corner of the EDRN to bring 4 parcels currently split by the rural boundary into the EDRN. And that's these parcels that are down here. So we're proposing to move the boundary to make sure that the whole parcel is included with that EDRN. Now moving to EDRNs number 8 and number 9. Those are the East Baseline Rancho Estates and Shepherd EDRN. First, EDRN number 8. Both the initiation draft plan and the downzone alternative recommend designating this area as a new EDRN. The EDRN is 1,058 acres with 137 parcels. Zoning in the area consists of Ag 15, Ag 110, and Ag 120, and no rezones are proposed as part of either the initiated plan or the downzone alternative. This new EDRN would be created as a result of moving the rural boundary to the northwest. Moving the rural boundary would leave an island of smaller lot residential development that fits the definition of EDRN and should not expand into the surrounding larger lot, ag productive lots. Number 9 is the second of the single parcel EDRNs located south of Baseline Avenue and east west of east of 154. The 80-acre parcel is zoned Ag 110 and is developed with 1 residential unit. The initiation draft plan would retain the existing EDRN designation for this parcel. The downzone alternative proposes to remove the EDRN boundary designation since a single parcel EDRN doesn't meet the technical definition of an existing developed rural neighborhood. The parcel would be rezoned to Ag 2 100 consistent with the surrounding zoning. EDN number 10 is the Meadowlark subdivision, and it's located south of Highway 246 and east of Refugio Road. The San Ynez River is directly south of the EDRN. This existing EDRN contains 68 parcels on 398 acres with a land use designation of Ag 15 and commensurate and associated zoning of Ag 15. Both the initiated draft plan and the downzone alternative propose adding 5 parcels, and those are the parcels that are shown in purple just south of the EDRN. These parcels are essentially located in the floodplain or active channel of the San Ynez River and have little or no development potential. Now shifting your attention away from the EDRNs, but talking about some of the zoning associated with the plan. The only parcels within zoning changes under the downzone alternative are those directly to the east of the urban boundary, which will be changing from Ag 15 to Ag 240, and the single parcel just south of the planning area and then adjacent to the southeast of the urban boundary and adjacent to the airport. Also, we have some other parcels that are within the plan that we want to bring your attention to. There's a school parcel that's just north of the school that's proposed to be rezoned for residential uses, just north of school. There's a parcel within just to the north part of kind of the San Ynez Township that is being rezoned from 1E1 to 3E1. There is some parcels that just adjacent to the high school that are proposed to be rezoned to C2, and that's where the YMCA facility is, and that's just essentially to make sure that the existing uses conform with the plan. We also have the same thing over here where the El Rancho Market is located, rezoning that particular parcel, so again, consistent with the uses that are on the site. We also have the mobile home park, which it currently today has some non-conforming densities, and that would bring those uses and densities into a conforming use. We have some lots just to the south of the area that would go into 1E1 to make those potential lots, were they to be subdivided and built consistent with the surrounding lots. So you can see there was some very strategic thinking that was brought in by the VPAC and GPAC in looking at lots and the compatibility with the surrounding neighborhoods. In terms of the Los Olivos zoning and urban boundary changes, both the initiation draft and downzone alternative recommend the same land use and zoning changes within the core areas of Los Olivos. The plan differs in the land use recommendation for the Los Olivos north of the urban boundary. So under the downzone alternative, it's proposing to shift the urban boundary that's north of Highway 154, bring that to the south of 154, and redesignate these areas from 1E1 to RR5, to Rural Ranchette 5 acres. That's really the significant change that's between the downzone alternative and the initiated plan. You can see that there's some other zones that rezoning that take place. Primarily, this is related to the C2 MU overlay and getting rid of a lot of the commercial highway, both under the initiated plan and the downzone alternative. There was a decision between the separator area between San Ynez and Los Olivos to rezone some of these parcels that are in active agriculture to rural Ranchette 5, keep a commercial, neighborhood commercial designation on a parcel where there's, I believe, an existing home today, and then a parcel over here to bring it to Ag 240 to make it more consistent with some of the existing uses in the irregular lot size. So again, the VPAC and the GPAC looked, clearly at making some changes that really designed at getting at that principal goal that was contained in the plan, and making sure that these parcels don't subdivide and are continue in a manner that is consistent with the San Ynez Valley character and neighborhood. Other rezones that I'm going to talk about is getting back to some of the EDRNs. Immediately west of the city of Buellton is the existing EDRN number 1, and it's comprised of the 18 parcels zoned Ag 15. The initiation draft plan recommends moving the rural boundary to the east, again coterminous with the city, and applying the EDRN boundary around the Ranchette neighborhood. No rezones are proposed as part of that EDRN. In terms of south of Buellton, immediately south of Buellton, and this is this parcel that's located right down here. So on your left is what's under the proposed plan, and here's what's under the downzone alternative. There's an isolated interrural parcel zone Ag 1-5. It's a single 34-acre parcel that's adjacent to active channel of the San Ynez River and has little or no potential to be subdivided further due to multiple constraints. The downzone alternative recommends moving the rural boundary to the north to be coterminous with the city of Buellton city limits or their urban boundary line, and rezone the parcel from Ag 1-5 to Ag 2-100, consistent with the adjacent zoning surrounding the parcel. Bobcat Springs EDRN, there is one parcel that is zoned commercial highway. I think this is Mr. Haas's property. I think he's come before the commission on several occasions. And that particular parcel is proposed to be rezoned. It's about an 8-acre parcel that's proposed to be rezoned to 1E1. Now focusing the attention now on the separator areas between the cities of Buellton and the cities of Solvang. Certainly this is one area where the community had wanted to pay attention to the transition and character between those two urban areas, wanted to make sure that the kind of pastoral aspects of those areas continued on into the future, and there wasn't land use densities and zoning that allowed those two cities to grow together and be indistinguishable in terms of character and nature. And this is certainly one of the more scenic aspects of the planning area. And in some of the parcels that are located, there's existing zoning to the area that is the existing zoning is predominantly Ag 140 with a mix of Ag 1-5 and Ag 110 and Ag 120 to the west and northeast. The initiated draft plan would retain the existing zoning designations within the area and apply the heritage sites overlay to several parcels which have the potential for further subdivision. The downzone alternative recommends downzoning these parcels to Ag 110 and Ag 120 and Ag 140 to minimize that potential, minimize the impacts to Ag, and disallow the ability for these parcels to further subdivide. Several changes will also occur just adjacent to the areas surrounding the township of Ballard. Two large clusters of parcels in the region will be rezoned from Ag 120 to Ag 240. One parcel immediately west of the Ballard Township will be rezoned from Ag 1-5 to Ag 120. And a cluster of parcels to the south, Ballard will be rezoned from Ag 1-5 to Ag 120. And finally, a parcel to the northeast corner of the area will be rezoned from Ag 110 to Ag 120. So you can see in particular the difference between the down zone and the plan, Ag 110, Ag 120, Ag 120, Ag 240, Ag 240, a shift of the rural boundary to bring it in closer to the township of Ballard. And then I think the other zone, and there's some, I think the other rezones and land use designations also switches as well as I reference in my talking points. Now moving our attention over to the Brinkerhoff area, and this is an area where we received a considerable amount of comments during the scoping of the final environmental impact report. First is the large block of ag parcels in the inner rural area, and these are vineyards and cultivated areas on the lower slopes near Mora Avenue. The predominant Ag 120 zoning and location of the adjacent, the area's location to the Woodstock Ranch subdivision, and I'm referring to these parcels right up here, is an indication of a likely development pressures in the future to subdivide these properties. The initiation draft proposes to retain the existing rural boundary and Ag 120 zoning for the area and apply the heritage site overlays to these particular properties, these ones and these ones as well. The downzone alternative, on the other hand, proposes to move these parcels into the rural area and change the zoning and land use from Ag 120 to Ag 2 100. So you can see here's the planned rural boundary, here's the downzone alternative rural boundary. So in the case of the plan, it stays in the inner rural area. In the case of the downzone alternative, it's put into the rural area. The same is said for the what are often referred to as the triangular parcels. They currently have Ag 1-5 designations, and there's multiple parcels within that particular area. Under the downzone alternative, the idea is to bring the rural boundary so that it's adjacent and coterminous with the urban boundary adjacent to Santa Ynez, and rezone it from Ag 1-5 to Ag 240. South of the township of Santa Ynez and south of the incorporated city of Solvang, 2 rural boundary adjustments are proposed under the downzone alternative to create a stable rural boundary. The existing rural boundary between Janet Acres and Refugio Road is generally coterminous with the urban boundary, with the exception of an irregular rural boundary which extends south from Janet Acres to Mesa Verde Road. The existing draft plan would retain the current rural boundary location and existing Ag 1-5 and Ag 120 zoning. And these are these parcels right here and the one over here just to the west, east of Solvang, east and south of Solvang. The downzone alternative would move the rural boundary north to be coterminous with the urban boundary, and the parcels would be rezoned to Ag 240. So that concludes staff's presentation, at least on the significant changes on land use and zoning designations. I think the maps are certainly the most instructive aspect to really point out the nuances of the boundary changes, both under the initiated plan and also under the downzone alternative. Certainly, I would recommend that the commissioners take whatever time you need, since you just received these maps today. And if there's any questions that you have, I think it would be very helpful to bring those back to staff. I think also I want to mention at this outset that we did provide the commission with a proposed self-guided tour that was requested by several commissioners to familiarize yourselves with on the land, with some of these policy decisions, and particularly the location and character and nature of these EDRNs. And certainly that booklet combined with some of these maps, I think will bring to light some of the tough policy considerations and choices that the GPAC wrestled with, both with coming up with the initiated plan recommendation and the down zone alternative. Now switching to public facilities and services, which is the second of the super elements of the community plan structure. And I'm going to run through these fairly quickly. I'm about, I'd say about 2/3 of my way through the presentation, so I anticipate probably I've got about an hour and a half or so left to get through the rest of the material. The number one, I think, issue related to public facilities and services is certainly traffic, and traffic and circulation is something that we saw as a reoccurring theme in the comments that were expressed to the county. The primary goal of the plan is to provide a very efficient and safe circulation system by incorporating land use patterns. And again, the driver of the circulation, the traffic, the congestion is the land use patterns, the densities and zoning that are ultimately decided upon for the Santa Ynez Valley. And I think it's clear that the Valley residents do not want to see further degradation of their system. In particular, there is a balance that is trying to be struck between achieving a level of service which in this case is proposed to be LOSB, and the roadway character and nature. I think the overall sense is that the valley does not want to build roadway capacity, make wider roads to accommodate more traffic, nor provide intersection controls, whether they're signalized or unsignalized controls, that really change the valley character and nature. So that was one particular aspect of the discussion that ultimately drove, I think, the land use densities that I just discussed. One additional point I do want to make is that the San Ynez Transportation Improvement Plan, which was a action item out of the San Ynez Plan and a mitigation that was identified in the final environmental impact report, is a project that was approved as part of our work program that went to the Board of Supervisors back on March 17th. So we'll be moving forward with, alacrity on development of that plan to make sure that we start to identify and cost out the roadway infrastructure improvements that is needed, over the planning horizon to accommodate the build out within the area. So what are the goals and policies in greater detail? Goal is to maintain that efficient, safe network for Valley residents, to adopt a level of service standard B for county roadway segments and intersections, understanding that really what the EIR concluded is that the county roadways and intersections aren't really the problems. Really the problems are the Highway 246 and Highway 154, which are state facilities owned and operated by the state, and the state has their own perspective on what is the level of service, minimum level of service for that backbone roadway system. And in the case of Caltrans, they have elected that a level of service D is the appropriate standard for those particular roadways. And so when I talk about the EIR, you're going to see today where we have some existing deficiencies, and looking out in the 10 and 20-year horizons where those deficiencies exacerbate over the time. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the concepts and approaches that Caltrans has considered in coming up with solutions for those areas. Thanks. The EIR concluded that there would be no Class 1 significant impacts. Class 2 impacts that were less than significant with mitigation. These areas that the county roadway segments operated fine at LOSB or better over a 10 and 20-year time horizon. The Class 2 impacts were primarily related to the 246 and 154 corridor. And in this instance, it's challenging for a local agency to dictate to the state about what they should do with their roadway infrastructure. Caltrans has some competing demands for resources, and so we really looked at coming up with solutions to options that they had considered in the past, particularly for Highway 246, and then some of the at-grade intersections on 154. And some of those are corridor operation changes, roundabout intersections, particularly roundabouts on 246. The city of Solvang has done some feasibility studies on some of those intersections, particularly Alamo Pintado and 246. They haven't come up with a preferred alternative, but it's some of the things that because that particular intersection, which is certainly pronounced and has a daily impact on Valley residents, it's really up to the city of city of Solvang and Caltrans to come up with a solution for that intersection. But that is something that they've explored. Improve signalized intersections, and this is really coordinating the timing of those of the signals within the city of Solvang. Does the reversible lane option, which is a concept that Caltrans explored in looking at adding a third lane between the city of Buellton and the city of Solvang, and adjusting cones so that they would have a counterflow when there's the flow going east or west, the predominant flow going east or west. They would adjust those cones and allow for two lanes coming in or out of Solvang. Of course, that option, as many people duly noted, doesn't address the fact that the highway through the city of Solvang is 2-lane, and so you may be relieving congestion through the separator area, but that congestion just may rematerialize when it hits in the city of Solvang. There was the 4-lane highway option. Certainly, that was something that Caltrans looked at. I think there was a tremendous amount of resistance to that. I don't think this is what Caltrans feels is appropriate for the area, given the bucolic and scenic nature of the area, but it was something that they needed to look at and looking at all options. And then there was 2 bypass options, and those are proposed roads that are south of the San Ynez River from Santa Rosa Road connecting over to Alisal Road. That particular option is something Caltrans looked at. Certainly there is a lot of obstacles with that option, notwithstanding environmental issues, property owner resistance, and other roadway interchange issues. But in the course of preparing the EIR, we wanted to make sure that we fully looked at those options and disclosed to the public the options that Caltrans considered, as previously considered, to deal with those congestion issues. One of the aspects of a community plan is that its super element structure is it does 2 things. One is it amends the land use element by coming up with land use designations and zoning, and comes up with policies and development standards. The second piece of how it amends the general plan is that it amends the circulation element. And the circulation element defers to the circulation maps within the community plan for the level of standards and services related to intersections and roadway segments. And this is just a brief, this is the map that was included as part of the initiated plan, and there's one change that is proposed. Edison Road is proposed to be redesignated from S1 to P3, and that's the segment that runs through Santa Ynez. And that's really looking at that particular roadway segment. The traffic engineers and our consultant ATE really felt that the roadway designation that was in the plan didn't accurately reflect the character and use of that particular area. So that's one proposed change that the EIR suggested to the circulation map. Related to circulation is the community plan bikeways map. Currently, there are approximately 5.9 miles of Class 1 and Class 2 bikeways in the San Ynez Valley. 1.8 of that is within the cities and 2.8 within the county, and the state has about 1.3 miles. These are existing lanes that are incorporated as part of the county's 1999 master bike plan. Really what this bikeways map does is really codify what was in the 1999 plan. It doesn't really propose new bikeways and classifications. Though most of these projects have not been constructed, all of the projects have been, in these designations, have been approved by previous board actions. There's certainly many aspects and components of the plan that remain unbuilt, and it's certainly a priority and something that the county is looking at to make sure we can try to come up with bike lanes to reduce the number of bike automobile conflicts within the valley. Now shifting to parks and recreation and trails. The primary goal is to provide recreation opportunities for visitors and residents, expand the trail network consistent with the goals and policies of the county agricultural element to the comprehensive plan. And that's a really key point. It's fair to say that trails within the valley and the siting of trails is of great concern to property owners and agriculturalists in the valley. trails, if not properly sited, have the potential to put hikers and walkers in areas that potentially could have a tremendous amount of conflict with active agricultural operations. And so that goal at its outset really recognizes that potential conflict looking into the future. And we have, as part of the community plan, is a set of trail siting guidelines that really addresses with that fundamental issue and was really meant to be a mitigative aspect of looking at trails look into the future. Coupling that with, there was a recreational demand study that was done within the valley. There was, I think it was done the same time that the recreation demand study was done within the south. Certainly, the plan recognizes that there's ample amount of recreation and open space, but I think that was identified in that recreational demand study is developed recreation facilities continue to be lacking. I'm going to talk a little bit about the standard that we have that's adopted as part of the land use element, and that really just provides for parks and open space, doesn't address whatever deficiencies we may have related to park and recreation facilities. So that standard is 4.7 acres of recreation space per 1,000 people. We anticipate within 20 years that the valley would have 25,000, a little over 25,000 people, and would require 120.47 acres of parkland. At 20 years, all the facilities in the valley would be just over that minimum requirement of 125 acres, which is again enough to meet that standard. And that doesn't include facilities that you typically look at as part of that calculation, golf courses. Of course, there's other regional parks that are located within the recreation demand area, and that's the area where we believe that people will reasonably travel in order to recreate. And that's the 358 acres of parkland located in Nahoe Falls and also Lake Kachuma Park, which are outside the plan area, but within the recreation demand area. So at total, if you include all that acreage, you'd have 642 acres of rec lands, which could support a population of over 130,000 people. We don't, again, it's really not the number of lands that is of issue, but the recreation facilities, which is something that we're going to need to work with our Parks Department on, making sure that those facilities are there into the future. The Santa Ynez Valley contains many miles of on-road and off-road trail opportunities for Valley residents. The majority of the off-road trails are located outside the planned area, but are accessible to Valley residents and are predominantly within the Los Padres National Forest. Most of the on-road trails are located within the plan area near the townships and the cities. The plan area does provide more on-road trail opportunities than officially stated, as most roads have ample side shoulders for hikers and equestrian use. In many cases, these on-road trails are used the public right-of-way along the road. Also, the county holds several existing trail easements on portions of Robler Avenue, Refugio Road, Figueroa Mountain Road, Armor Ranch Road, and segments of Happy Canyon Road. Look into the trail siting guidelines. Those guidelines look, should the county want to consider any trails out in the future. One important aspect of this particular, and this is a PRT map, the Parks and Recreation Trails map, which is amended to the land use element, is that this plan does not propose to add any new off-road trails that are not already on the existing PRT map. And trails, and particularly the river trail, was one of great concern and discussion to Valley residents. At the end of the day, the Board of Supervisors decided to initiate a plan that did not include many controversial trails. Now focusing on wastewater policies.
Before you go beyond that, I had one question. When I read through the staff report and partially through the EIR, I was surprised to see that I didn't see any recreational facilities relating to soccer. I know several months ago, we had a proposal from a group to rezone some ag land from its current designation to a soccer field, and I see Mr. Chamberlain's in the audience, and he assured me that there was all kinds of proper land that could be rezoned and used for that, but I didn't see any in this plan. That was somewhat disappointing. I wondered if you could comment on that.
Mr. Chairman and members of the commission, the plan does not designate any areas for active recreation or passive recreation, with the exception of the small park within the township of Los Olivos. There are a host of policies that are in the plan and also mitigations within the plan that, should a proposal come forward to designate a site, they would need to comply with. I think certainly, as you saw with the project that was proposed in Santa Rosa Road, there is great concern about recreation fields displacing active agricultural operations. And it appears to me that if those concerns are the drivers for site selection, the sites that ultimately may need to come forward down the road may be conjunctive use sites in working with existing schools and other facilities within the urban areas. And I think the policies that are in the plan, there's an action item, PRT SYV 1.4, the county shall encourage future development of playing fields in the San Ynez planning area to serve the needs of Valley residents. And that action item is coupled with other action items that the county shall work with the schools. So there was an expressed policy preference of the Valley as part of this plan to really look to site any future soccer facility on school facilities.
This is not time for comment, but that's not going to work for me, and we can get into it later on that issue. But
now transitioning to wastewater policies, the Valley area has many special problems areas and has locations where wastewater disposal has been a challenge and continues to be of concern both to public health and also to the Regional Water Quality Control Board. Recognizing that there was an existing environment that had these types of challenges, policies were developed and action items were developed to look to address those challenges and to come up with long-term solutions. The overall goal, of course, is to maintain and provide adequate wastewater treatment and disposal throughout the planning area. We want to make sure that we have the highest level of wastewater treatment and provide the best service to maintain and protect public health and welfare. There was, of course, a wrestling with the acknowledgement that some of these areas were problems areas, and they had challenges with disposing of wastewater with the expansion of this type of public infrastructure and the potential for it to cause and encourage sprawl and growth. So there was one particular policy that the VPAC put forward, which is that annexation of the interrural and rural areas to sanitary districts should not be permitted unless it is needed to prevent adverse impacts on environmentally sensitive habitat or protect public health. Again, if you could come up with on-site controls, whether it's septic system, dry wells, or through compact treatment plants, those were the preferred expressed options for the community, as they didn't want to have expansion of this facility, encourage the type of density and infill of these interrural and rural areas. But if it's just needed in order to address those public health issues, they wanted to see that happen. The cities of Solvang and Buellton are the operators of wastewater treatment plants in the San Ynez Valley. The San Ynez Community Services District provides their effluent to the city of Solvang, a wastewater treatment plant, which collects and treats all of the discharge from the city and from the CSD boundaries. It has a capacity of 1.5 million gallons per day and is contractually allocated between the city of Solvang 1.2 and Santa Ynez Community Service District 0.29. The city of Buellton owns and operates a wastewater treatment facility which serves, of course, the city and has a capacity of 0.65 million gallons per day. The Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians has recently constructed a 200,000 gallon capacity wastewater treatment plant on the reservation. That plant is owned by the tribe, but my understanding is that they contract with the Santa Ynez Community Service District to provide the services to operate and maintain that plant. We have 4 special problems areas within the valley, and the special problems areas are areas that the county has designated either for multiple reasons, whether it's high fire, whether there's special geologic soil conditions. And in the valley in particular, these areas have been designated because of soil conditions and lot sizes that make it challenging to provide on-site waste disposal. And these are the area of Los Olivos, Ballard, Janet Acres, and to the area west east of the township of Santa Ynez. One thing I want to point out about the special problems areas is they do require additional discretionary review by the special problems area committee, and that committee is comprised of roads, county flood control, planning and development, county health services, and county fire departments. So they look at projects in these particular area with a particular eye, particularly related to wastewater, understanding and knowing that disposal of wastewater in those areas is a challenge, and they do require a specific test to make sure that any development that comes in within those areas meets whatever standards that have been set forth by the Regional Water Quality Control Board. One point I do want to make is you can see there's an overlap of the proposed mixed-use overlay and the Los Olivos special problems areas. Certainly looking out in the future, if you're going to encourage increased development, residential development within a special problem area, and knowing that there's on-site treatment issues, that is going to be something that the county is going to need to look at in the future, and I'm going to talk about the action items and the mitigations that look to address those fundamental policy inconsistencies of the special problem areas designation and the infill potential under the mixed-use overlay. Well, the EIR concluded that cumulative contribution of the additional flows will likely trigger and exceed the 75% design capacity for the CSD system, triggering the need for facility expansion. It looked at the potential to provide municipal wastewater services to both Los Olivos and Ballard areas, whether that's connecting through to the Santa Ynez CSD system or coming up with its own system. Additional demands will be made on the resources for the management and any on-site systems and operations of facilities, i.e. septic tanks, dry wells, etc., would certainly exacerbate existing groundwater conditions within the valley. Build out, if it occurs and there is not expanded wastewater treatment options for those special problem areas, would likely result in septic system use and potentially exacerbate and existing associated water quality impacts. What are the action items and what are the mitigations? The plan proposes to work with the City of Solvang, the CSD, and the Water Quality Control Board to make sure that wastewater disposal is adequate as we look forward into build out. It proposes to study the possibility of implementing a sewage service and infrastructure in Janet Acres subdivision to the central areas west of Santa Ynez. And this essentially happens with our public health department. Looking at a wastewater wastewater treatment plan. What these feasibility studies do is look at opportunities for either connecting to a wastewater treatment facility or coming up with a list of alternatives so that both the county and the area residents have a full understanding of what are the options available to address this existing condition. Now switching to water resources, the San Ynez River Water Conservation District number 1 is the sole public water provider in the San Ynez Valley Community Plan area. ID number 1, as the district is commonly referred to, serves the communities of San Ynez, Los Olivos, Ballard, and the Chumash Indian Reservation. ID number 1 employs a conjunctive use strategy utilizing many different water supplies, whether it's state water, Kachuma Water Project, groundwater from the San Ynez Uplands, and groundwater from the San Ynez River Alluvial Basin to provide a reliable service to its constituents in a wide range of hydrologic conditions. 17 smaller public water systems serving fewer than 200 service connections and numerous private water systems are located throughout the planning areas. Those private water systems are essentially wells. All of these types of systems are regulated by the Santa Barbara County Environmental Health Services. The incorporated cities of Buellton and Solvang do not provide water to the residents within the planning area, but do draw water from area water supply sources. So what is the goal of the plan? The goal is to maintain and protect water supply and quality and make sure that the basins do not stay in a state of prolonged overdraft. Recognizing there may be times where there is an imbalance within the basin, but making sure that the land use and densities maintain an overall balance and make sure that there is not a prolonged overdraft of the basins, which are a critical element in providing a safe and stable supply to Valley residents. Additionally, recognize that we are in a drought area, and the policies look to make sure that the new development incorporates water efficient design, technology, and particularly landscaping. The ERR concluded that development, in order to mitigate its impacts on water, needed to be constructed incorporating all of the water conserving features that the county imposes as part of its standards conditions of approval for all discretionary and ministerial projects to come forward, and that in the event that gray water or is made available within the valley, to try to use recycled water in a manner that relieves some of the demands on the supply side of the equation. Looking at the analysis, certainly the San Ynez Uplands basins is probably the basin where most people pay attention to, and there's a map both in the EIR and in the community plan to provide an illustration of where these basins lie and how they're used in terms of providing supply to Valley residents. The San Ynez Uplands Basin looks at a safe yield of roughly 8,970 acre feet a year to 9,800 acre feet per year. There is certainly, as you see within the EIR, there is dispute amongst experts as to what is the safe yield from that particular basin up to potentially 11,500 acre feet per year. The city of Solvang, ID1, and ag uses are the types of pumpage that occurs from that particular basin. We believe that the total annual pumpage is 10,987 acre feet per year. So it is fairly close to what the net safe yield was that was identified in the 2005 groundwater report, and also within the range of other studies which came up with additional number related to what they believe was safe yield for that particular basin. One important point I do want to make is that the county is looking to update the groundwater report. The Public Works Department right now is currently doing an extensive study of the Cuyama basins, and I think that is the front runner looking at other efforts to update that 2005 groundwater report to make sure that we look at all areas of Santa Barbara County. The second basin is the Buellton Uplands Basin. You can see it's got a surplus of about 800 acre feet per year. In the San Ynez River Basin, safe yield really is not applicable because it's not subject to overdraft, largely because of a lot of the infiltration that happens from Kachuma and just the actual settling of water that's released for anadromous fish, the steelhead, that are to just below Bradbury Dam. In terms of water allocation to ID number 1, we have a contracted amount for Lake Kachuma of 2,651 acre feet per year. A long-term delivery under drought conditions of 1,750. State water project, the ID1 only is 500 acre feet per year, long-term delivery 330. You can see today we have a pretty sizable amount of acre feet demand, both the predominant use being residential and commercial uses, 3,500 acre feet over a 20-year time frame, a small incremental increase over a 20-year period for a 20-year demand estimated at 4,178 acre feet per year. We did certainly trigger under our thresholds manual the significance thresholds for 2 of the basins, the San Ynez basins and the Buellton Basin. So the conclusion of the EIR was that additional residential and non-residential development under build-out conditions would obviously require additional water. There was the ID number 1, as they expressed in their comments, and that we concluded in our EIR, is that the infrastructure network for the water delivery may not be adequate to serve the growth anticipated under the plan. So certainly as development comes in and they want to hook up to the municipal water system, in order to get that can and will serve with that district, they'll need to make sure that they pay whatever development and impact fees that ID1 needs in order to provide municipal water service to those areas. And that increased water demand in the study area would be met by a combination of public water system, mutual water system, and private wells. And certainly the groundwater report that we do will certainly continue to inform the status of water conditions within the valley, but recognizing that this is a Class 1 issue, and that the EIR and the development standards could not come up with mitigations to reduce it to less than a significant level. Public services and fire protection obviously is an issue that is of great concern to Valley residents, since the Valley has been designated as a high fire area. The Santa Barbara County Fire Department provides fire suppression and fire prevention and life safety services to all unincorporated areas in Santa Barbara County, which includes the entire plan area. In the Sandia Valley region, the fire department operates 3 fire stations 30, 31, and 32. These fire stations are staffed 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The county fire department employs the following standards with respect to the provision of fire services. a firefighter to population ratio of one firefighter on duty for 24 hours a day for every 2,000 people in population is considered ideal, although they looked at a minimum to have one firefighter for every 4,000 people as the maximum population that can be adequately served. The second criterion that they look at is that they want to provide a fire protection standard and a 5-minute response time within urban areas. This incorporates the following objectives of 1 minute 60 seconds for turnout time and 4 minutes or less for the arrival of the first arriving engine company. The standards that were outlined in the community plan is to maximize the effective fire prevention and services to Valley residents. The policy is to maintain and ensure that there's adequate personnel, equipment to meet the population growth over time, and that response time and the ability to fight the types of hazards within the planning area are properly met. Next slide. The EIR concluded that there would be a Class 1 impact related to the provision of public services fire protection, and that a new fire station needs to be built in Los Olivos as funding becomes available. So in this particular instance, we'll be working with our colleagues in the fire department to look at whatever development fees or standards are appropriate in order to address the inadequacy of, and this is just largely related to response time within Los Olivos, to make sure that the response time is adequate for that particular township. Police protection. The county fire department, county police department, and sheriff's department, I should say, is responsible for providing law enforcement services to both the city of Solvang and the city of Buellton through contracts, but also to the unincorporated residents as well. The two sheriff's department stations are located within the planning area, one in Buellton and one in Solvang. It's located just adjacent to the court facilities. These stations double as police stations for the respective cities, but also serve as sheriff's substations as well. The sheriff deputies are augmented by the California Highway Patrol, who provide traffic and roadway enforcement along unincorporated roads throughout Santa Barbara County, but particularly the backbone system of Highway 246 and Highway 154. A lot of the comments that we heard in the comment period expressed concern, particularly related to wineries and tasting rooms, and a concern about the expansion of those facilities and impacts it may have on law enforcement. And I know the CHP has been very successful in the past at getting grant monies. I think last year they had upwards of almost 10,000 additional man hours to provide additional traffic enforcement along the Central Coast highways. I understand that the 3rd District Office continues to work with the CHP to make sure that we can continue to see this higher level of enforcement related to traffic issues along the state highway and county roadways. What the EIR ultimately concluded is that there's adequate police services in the valley today, both in terms of patrol and into the future, looking out in the 20-year time horizon. Now shifting to solid waste, the plan proposes to look to implement recycling and composting programs, which are fairly active within the townships, the urban areas of the Santa Ynez Valley. Additionally, identifying a proper mechanism to dispose of hazardous waste facilities is one of the action items within the valley. And from time to time, the County Public Works Department will bring out mobile hazardous waste disposal facilities and bring them out into the valley so that valley residents have the ability to properly dispose of their hazardous waste. The county has a threshold which is numerical in nature in identifying a impact as significant if the project in itself is going to generate more than 196 tons per year, which is a proportion of the capacity residual capacity at the Tehiguas landfill. The plan, the EIR concluded that at full build-out, or excuse me, 20-year build-out, the plan would generate an additional 2,454 tons of solid waste per year. And this was determined to be a significant and unavoidable impact, and that's primarily related to its impact at the Tehiguas landfill. I guess before we go to schools, just go one slide back, is some of the mitigation measures that are proposed is requiring solid waste plans for both commercial and residential units. I think of 5 units or greater, those plans are now required as part of development applications. Schools. The Valley, I think, is recognized for having some outstanding schools within the Santa Barbara County, and the Valley residents want to make sure that the outstanding quality of education continues and that schools are not unduly impacted as a result of development. And there are 2 pieces within the plan that direct the county to continue to work with the schools to make sure that they have the type of facilities and the capacity to provide both elementary and high school and junior high education to Valley residents. This was a graph that we included in the EIR. It showed that in general we're seeing a dropping enrollment within the San Ynez Valley, with the exception of Buellton Elementary School and Los Olivos School. Overall, we're seeing roughly a 5% decrease in enrollment from 2001 to 2007, 2008. And that's just essentially comports with the changing demographic that we're seeing county-wide, where we're seeing older residents move in, 2-person households with kids that have either left and gone somewhere else, or don't have kids that are going to public schools. Just before you move on, the EIR concluded ultimately that under California statute that the payment of development impact fees to schools as a result of development, as is consistent with that law, is adequate mitigation under CEQA. Now moving into the third part of the super element component of the community plan, which is the resources and constraints section. I'm going to finish this third part, and then I'll be transitioning then to some of the pieces that I outlined early as part of the presentation. I'll first start off with biology. The primary biological goals of the plan state that biological resources in the community plan area are an important regional asset and should be protected, enhanced, and preserved. In order to protect the biological resources that are identified as environmentally sensitive habitat, They shall be protected and preserved through a series of development standards and mitigations and action items. Policy Bio SYV3 states that significant biological communities shall not be fragmented by development into smaller, non-viable areas. So not only protecting the integrity of individual areas and making sure that standards and mitigations dealt with development as it came in, but also looking at the overall ecosystems as a whole, making sure that there was some interconnection between these areas so they could function both from a perspective of flora and fauna management. Looking at also development and making sure that pollution that's generated from development doesn't find its way into the streams and creeks, particularly San Ynez River. The county now has a whole set of best management practices that we employ when new development comes in through our clean water program, and will impose, and part of the mitigations look to provide and impose those BMPs on development as it moves forward. And additionally, looking at native landscaping will be encouraged, especially in the parks and buffer areas adjacent to native habitats and designated open space. So the policies look to make sure that we're not bringing in new invasive plant species within the area that may compromise the existing biological environment and the wealth of the natural system. This was a map that was prepared as part of the EIR. There was certainly a host of studies that were done as the plan was being developed. This is a vegetation map that shows the different habitat types in the plan area. What this map will be used for is there's some criterion in the San Ynez Community Plan that identifies certain habitats as being potentially sensitive in nature, and the plan itself does not designate any environmentally sensitive habitat as a particular overlay. And the contrary, it looks at coming up with using this vegetation map in concert with a policy which outlines which particular vegetation types and areas are environmentally sensitive habitat, and then imposes a set of standards and policies on projects should your project be located within those environmentally sensitive areas.
Commissioner Brown has a question.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, I note in looking at some of these standards for setbacks from some of these areas that they're varying, and my question has to do with the setback of 25 feet in the urban and inner rural areas. It just seems to me, in looking at county projects, we've never seen this 25 feet number. It's always usually 50, I think. Is that something new to this plan or to this area, or what is that consideration? How was that developed?
Commissioner Blau and Commissioner Brown, I think ultimately that is a number that reflects the desire of the community to want to make sure that development, if it's going to occur in some of these lots, the remaining lots that have not been built out are certainly constrained, that the standards in no way prevent the ability for development of those sites, but also trying to balance out the setback in a manner that protects those habitats. And certainly it's typically the county has a higher number. 50 feet is the typical number that we use, but recognizing the smaller lots and the lot configuration, that number may have been somewhat onerous on some particular projects.
But this is in the inner rural areas where it's 20, usually those lots are larger and you're not smaller lots. Oh, okay.
The EIR concluded that there would be Class 1 impacts in several areas, largely related to the cumulative impacts of the plan. And again, these Class 1 impacts would happen with or without the plan, because that same amount of development is allowed under the existing comprehensive plan. Despite all of the policies and mitigations and development standards, still nonetheless, the EIR concluded that there would be Class 1 impacts related to impacts to sensitive habitats, related to the plan build-out and rezones, impacts to special status plants, the same category, and onto animals and also to wildlife corridors. So even despite the best efforts of the plan to look at coming up with these policies and mitigations, it was just concluded that given the amount of development that's allowed, these impacts could not be brought down to a less than significant level. What do these impact mitigations look like? Several of the policies will be added, and development standards, policies will be amended, or development standards will be added to the plan in order to mitigate the policies to the biological resources. Some of these amendments provide clarity and specificity to mitigate and avoid sensitive habitats. Development standards 8.1, 8.3, 14.1, 2, and 3 are proposed to be amended to provide clarity and specificity related to development standards to protect and avoid mitigate impacts to sensitive plants. 14.4 is proposed to provide guidance and direction under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to protect, avoid, and mitigate impacts to special status animals. And last, Development Standards 3.1 is proposed to be amended to provide a description of habitats that may provide wildlife corridors to protect, avoid, and mitigate impacts to wildlife corridors. So that was just a small sampling of the development standards and policies and mitigations that related to biological impacts. I think that was one area that was safe to say that we saw a fair amount of comments. In particular, there was a comment that was related to impacts to oak trees and related to impacts as a result of grazing. And in looking at that particular mitigation measure, we certainly agreed with all of the commenters that as it was written, it certainly was going to be an onerous mitigation and certainly not reflective of the impact that was identified to be mitigated. Now shifting to flooding and drainage. The plan contains numerous policies and development standards designed to minimize adverse effects to floodways and drainage. Flood risks would be minimized through appropriate design and land use controls, as well as through feasible engineering solutions to address existing problems. The plan strives to minimize short and long-term erosion associated with development. Flood control maintenance activities will also seek to minimize disturbance to riparian wetland habitats, consistent with the primary need to protect public safety. Additional guidance for public maintenance work projects is provided by Flood Control's district's current Certified Master Program EIR and approved standard maintenance practices. Proposed development other than flood control activities shall be designed to maintain creek banks, channel inverts, channel bottoms in their natural state, and revegetation to restore riparian habitat is encouraged and may be required for particular projects. Policy Flood SYV 1 provides that flood risks shall be minimized through appropriate design and land use controls, again through feasible engineering solutions to address existing problems.
I'm sorry. Commissioner Valencia has a
Mr.
question.
Chair, I just have one quick question. Mr. Johnson, this blue line on the San Ynez, is that a 25-year, 50-year, or 100-year flood picture?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Valencia, that is the 100-year.
Thank you. That's good enough.
Segueing to that map, this is in fact the map that's based upon the FEMA hazard overlay that FEMA puts out and updates periodically. and we've included that in the EIR as part of, in the plan as well, to make sure that planners and project owners are clearly aware of where there's the potential for flood hazards. The EIR concluded that there was no significant impacts related to flooding and drainage. Analysis of the impacts resulted in Class 2 but mitigatable impacts to less than significant levels as part of the BMPs and the standard practices that the county requires as a result of reviewing the particular projects. And again, this is at a programmatic level. It did identify that there may be temporary water quality impacts. There might be long-term hydrological impacts in terms of building over areas that might see water be able to percolate back into the water basins. Potential impact with long-term water quality impacts, looking to reduce those to the extent feasible with our best management practices, and also the potential to create additional flood hazard impacts. Since we are down river from the Bradbury Dam, there is the dam inundation hazard related to Bradbury Dam, and we looked at that and found that it would be a Class 2 impacts with the mitigations and practices that are currently in place for the operations of that facility. Overall, there would be cumulative impacts to hydrology and water quality impacts, but those were determined with the mitigations to be less than significant with the required mitigations. Geology, hillslides, and topography. There are no active faults mapped across the San Ynez Community Plan area. Additionally, there are no Alquist-Priello earthquake fault zones mapped in the area as well. Therefore, there was no impact related to the seismically induced ground rupture. The plan area has the potential to be subjected to ground shaking from many other faults, whether within or outside the plan area. There are roughly 7 faults that are directly associated with having the potential to impact the San Ynez Community Plan area. However, the application of development standards that are imposed on projects through building review by our building department would reduce the ground shaking impacts to less than a significant level. There may be areas within the valley that would be subject to liquefaction, which is the loss of soil strength due to ground shaking. And again, we would be any project that would have come forward for application for development would need to have those particular soils looked at and come up with an engineering solution consistent with the building standards by our department. Geology, hillsides, and topography. Certainly there is areas within the valley that are comprised of steep slopes and can become unstable. And specifically, we would look to impose the typical standard conditions on building on lots that have slopes of concern for the county. Also of concerns in these areas of hillsides is the ability to properly put in wastewater disposal systems. Certainly, public health department, when any project comes forward, will look at a particular development application to make sure that any septic systems met the requirements, particularly if it was on a slope parcel.
I think this is probably a really good time to break for lunch. Do you all agree? Great. I think we'll go ahead and break for lunch now and be back here promptly at 1 o'clock. Thank you. Almost. Mr. Johnson, you're back on board.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, just to continue our presentation, I believe we left off with concluding our presentation on resources and constraints. Now we're going to talk a little bit and kind of segue into portions of, well, I guess we have a couple more pieces in that section, but we wanted to highlight before we got into history and archaeology, one of the statutory requirements that is the county is required to follow anytime we engage in a specific plan or general plan amendment. And this plan was initiated for preparation prior to the passage of SB 18. And certainly the county wanted to make sure we did everything we could to outreach to the Chumash as part of developing this plan. And though this plan had really been initiated for environmental review after the law had taken place, and really there wasn't direct engagement in shaping the plan and amending the plan during the process, we wanted to engage them in our consultations before we initiated environmental review. And so we met with the Chumash on 4 separate occasions, typically in their office, and we had some very engaging and fruitful discussions looking at how the county looks at and treats sensitive cultural resources, particularly within the plan area. They brought on board, and we were certainly appreciative of the resources that they provided to this project. A consultant that worked hand in hand with our consultant, Applied Earthworks, in coming up with a predictive model to look at when there might be a high probability of cultural resources looking forward as planners look at development projects. And through these rounds of discussions, we were able to come up with essentially a predictive model and a map that designates areas as low, medium, and high, and very high in terms of where we might find cultural resources, archaeological resources related to them living in the valley for the last 17,000 plus years. And certainly we think that model is now a vast improvement over what we had in the past in terms of trying to avoid and mitigate impacts to cultural resources. Where we were unable to find agreement was one aspect of the provision, which was to try to come up with a potential listing of sites or sacred sites, and I think we're going to continue to outreach to the Chumash Nation as we move forward with any projects, and I think I am hoping a working relationship where they'll feel comfortable coming to us when any project should impact any sacred places that the tribe has identified. And certainly one of the mitigation measures is to continue to work with experts within their organization to assist the county to make sure that those mitigations happen. Another outgrowth of that consultation process was certainly an acknowledgement that the county needs to take a look at its archaeological CEQA guidelines, and that is something that we're going to be working with Joyce Gerber in development review and taking a look at those guidelines to make sure that they're robust enough and updated so that we can continue to have the best practice in mitigating impacts to those resources. Moving then into, well, what did the EIR find? The EIR ultimately concluded that the constructions of homes and necessary infrastructure to support them, along with any other related improvements for public services such as fire stations and police stations and parks and so forth, and any circulation improvements would have significant potential impact on the archaeological resources within the valley. Certainly, moreover, the potential incentives for mixed-use development within the townships of Ballard and Los Olivos and Santa Ynez has the potential to impact and compromise some of the existing historical structures that are located within the valley. Certainly, the design guidelines that are an action item out of, a proposed action item out of the plan would, in fact, mitigate to a large extent a lot of the impacts to those historical resources when the county moves forward with their implementation. I think it's really important to note that a lot of the impacts, and this is, I think, a central theme throughout today's presentation, is that the impacts in this particular issue, but the other ones as well, would occur both under the existing comprehensive plan and the proposed plan, since the amount of development under the 20 and build-out scenarios are roughly the same. There were some policies that were put in to address the obvious and, I think, overarching viewpoint to protect the rural and agricultural character of the valley and to maintain scenic viewpoints and corridors and view sheds. And particularly, I think a lot of people move to the valley, reside in the valley for the nighttime sky. And the outdoor lighting ordinance is one aspect, looking to preserve and protect the nighttime sky. Additionally, the policy environment looks to seek to minimize development impacts on view corridors from public roadways and viewpoints. This does not intrude into private viewpoints, mainly just addresses public viewpoints. It also requires that new or altered buildings and structures within the design overlay be subject to architectural design review, and that all plans comport with the outdoor lighting ordinance. And this will be one central piece of when the county does move forward with the creation of the residential design, the design guidelines, that we will need to come up with some lighting standards to help people along, to give some people an example, and I think it will probably be helpful to require a lighting plan. We've seen in some places where projects that move forward without design guidelines, a little confusion about what's required for review, and that'll be one issue that we'll want to clear up.
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Brown.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, if I recall correctly, in the Los Alamos plan, there were guidelines on signs, maybe? Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Brown, that's correct.
Was there any consideration of that in this plan? Or is that in the document by any chance? Anything?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Brown, the outdoor lighting ordinance does deal with illuminated signs.
But there's nothing on signs per se over and above what, as was done in Los Alamos plan.
That's correct. Any sort of sign guidelines would be a product of the township guidelines that we would draft for each individual community.
Okay, great. Thank you.
The EIR concluded both under the initiated plan and the existing comp plan that there would be significant and unavoidable impacts as a result of build-out to the visual character, and that there would be a cumulative impact to the visual character to the valley. The EIR identified a host of mitigation measures to address the cumulative visual impacts, and particularly noted the beneficial impact related to the D-design overlay at mitigating the impacts related to the cumulative and individual growth that would occur. Air quality, this is a new section that the county is paying attention to as it develops draft EIRs and EIRs for both development projects and programmatic comprehensive plan amendments. And we've now seen just recently on April 13th, the OPR forwarded to the Resources Agency copies of proposed regulatory changes to implement AB 32. This was the tag-on bill, SB 97, that required OPR to develop statutory amendments and reg changes to the CEQA guidelines. So we see more and more the state and regulators coming up with a consensus about a paradigm and approach to address greenhouse gas emissions within the context of CEQA. And while in this interim phase, I think all of us, the practitioners of CEQA and planners, have been challenged with coming up with an interim approach to addressing greenhouse gas emissions. And we've worked carefully with council to make sure that we have used the best objective information to come up with an approach to quantify greenhouse gas emissions and come up with appropriate mitigation measures. I think, until we see some further milestones reached that were outlined in SB 375 and AB 32, it's been the county's approach that it's premature to come up with any significance determination until we come up with a standard methodology and some thresholds for greenhouse gas emissions. What we did in preparing this EIR and this kind of changing environment was really look to the different papers that were coming out along the way, whether it was from CAPCOA, it was from OPR, whether it was from the California Air Resources Board, or from Jerry Brown. We looked to all those documents that had some suggested best management practices to address greenhouse gas emissions. I think the most important point, of course, is that the amount of difference under the proposed plan versus the comp plan is not very significant amount of growth. Nonetheless, we felt in looking at conducting our analysis, which looks at a ground to plan event horizon, or in this case, a ground to 20-year event horizon, we determined that while we didn't want to make a significance determination, we felt that it was appropriate to look to a whole host of proposed mitigation and development standards that had been suggested by these different agencies. And so the EIR proposes several policies and actions that would encourage alternative modes of travel, look to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we felt that in terms of the list of options that were available to the county, the list of mitigations that I'm going to talk about on the next slide were a fair and reasonable approach given the level of uncertainty related to quantifying and mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a sampling of the proposed development standards and policies related to greenhouse gas emissions, and some of them were recommended. The first one, for example, was recommended by the Air Pollution Control District, and that's to deal with stationary equipment, construction equipment, and it's to require that the equipment be maintained. The second one would require and encourage, where feasible, development projects to exceed by Title 24 20% where feasible, which Title 24 is the energy requirement, the energy calculations that the county does as part of reviewing development projects. We would also look to have both Caltrans and the county install LED lights to conserve energy. We would look to create policies to regulate and minimize idling times for delivery and construction vehicles. And the action 1.2 is an actual outgrowth of the plan itself, which would commit 20% of the transportation impact fees collected to alternative transportation, whether this is improving transit in the valley for residents to move around, whether it's to increase other modes of transportation such as bicycles and pedestrians. Those are the types of improvements that it seeks to fund. And certainly we've heard some comments that one of the ideas that we might be able to remove some vehicles, at least some of the weekend traffic, is coming up with some sort of wine shuttle or some sort of shuttle to move people around between wineries, and that's certainly something that we could investigate as part of the development of the TIP. Additionally, there's a standard that looks to require 20% or more reduction in electricity needs for developments of 5 or more units, and requires the county to pursue the feasibility of establishing a sustainable energy financing district.
Commissioner Brown has a question.
Mr. Johnson, where in the community plan is this?
Commissioner Brown, these standards are not found in the actual community plan. These are mitigation measures that are found in the EIR under the air quality section, and so the proposed EIR proposes to amend the plan to add these policies and development standards as a mechanism to mitigate and address greenhouse gas emissions.
And do you happen to have a page number in the EIR where they are? Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Brooks.
Yes, thank you, Chair Blau. Mr. Johnson, I remember reading a letter from a member of the public regarding the bike path issue and why is this in recreation and not transportation. If there's going to be an increased emphasis, on air quality, I believe the response in the EIR came back that this would remain as recreational rather than as a transportation issue. And it seems to me, this is a perfect time to start promoting, the bike lane issue, bike paths, as a form of transportation, versus seeing it as just recreational.
Chairman Blau and Commissioner Brooks, I think certainly that's the perspective that we've taken. We look to separate it for purposes of kind of functionality in the plan, and the parks traditionally administers the bikes, at least the Class 1 bike lanes. Public Works does the Class 2 and Class 3 bike lanes. And so I think certainly we're going to think of it holistically, not only in the sense of that it's a recreation asset were to be constructed, but also that it's a transportation asset as well. And certainly the 20% of the fees that would be collected for alternative transportation, as has been done in the Goleta Valley, certainly could be applied to fund bicycle circulation improvements. Now switching back to the EIR, we are of course required under CEQA to look at alternatives, and one of the required alternatives to look at is the no project alternative. And this assumes that the San Ynez Community Plan is not adopted and there's no policy direction provided specific for the San Ynez Valley, and the 1980-1981 comprehensive plan has not changed. Staff is not recommending that this project alternative because it does not include the numerous policies and standards, et cetera, that are largely mitigative in nature, that address build out both under the comp plan and under the proposed San Ynez Valley Community Plan. And additionally, the no project alternative does not address some of the other goals of the community plan, which were related to the lack of affordable or housing sites within the valley. And the alternatives are always weighed against the project objectives, and clearly in this case, not adopting the plan didn't meet any of the objectives. Well, how does the build out look under the alternative one? Roughly where you see the delta in the change is roughly they're the same. You see the same number of primary units, the same number of additional second units. There are no affordable housing residential units. Under the down zone and plan, you would see 76 additional RSUs or secondary units that would be added. Under the no project alternative versus weighing that against the initiated plan, as I mentioned before, we think we'll see 30,000 less commercial space as a result of residential uses being a predominant use within that zone district. The second alternative that was analyzed, and this was the alternative that was identified in the September 26, 2006 community plan that was initiated by the board. The board was very specific in the down zone alternative to be analyzed in the CEQA document. I think, down zones and the notion of changing in land use designations and zoning was of great importance and discussion within both the GPAC and VPAC process. And certainly both the GPAC and VPAC took very seriously their charter with having to look at in coming up with any suggested land use designations. And ultimately, it was decided that they would propose in its appendix, I think it's, I'll get to you the appendix number, but it was included in the community plan to look at the specific sites for the down zone. And if you look at it, again, this is just to refresh from the earlier slide, a net reduction in 20 units of primary, we think over a 20-year time horizon, 111 less secondary units, and that's related to RSUs not being allowed in some of the higher ag districts, such as Ag 140 and in the Ag 2 zone districts. Both under the down zone and under the proposed plan, both of them do provide for the affordable housing overlay sites, so that number is the same. So at the end of the day, you would see 131 net less units under the down zone alternative. And staff's recommendation of suggesting the down zone alternative was based again upon that primary goal within the plan. We also felt that any offset reduction in the number of units that you would find in the areas to be down zone would be offset by the affordable housing sites that were identified by the VPAC, in addition to the incentives that were provided in the mixed-use overlay within the townships of Ballard and Los Olivos. The third alternative that was analyzed looked at the same exact project description, the same amount of build out, but modifying the D-design overlay. And under this alternative, the D-design overlay would only apply to the first 1,000 feet of the public roadways and viewing areas rather than the entire parcel. And in this case, the alternative ultimately concluded that there would be a greater amount of impacts related to visual and aesthetics, because the D-design overlay may not cover building envelopes that may be outside of that 1,000 feet from the public roadway, and therefore it considered it to be an inferior alternative to the project description, which looked to and cover the entire parcel. However, I think it's important to note, even with the project description, that on ag parcels in particular, if a parcel is out of the 1,000-foot envelope from that roadway and is not within a public viewing area or visible from that public viewing area, then in itself, even though it's under the design overlay, it would be exempt from bar review. The fourth alternative that was looked at was a consideration of mixed-use overlay to the Ballard Township. And there was some questions about, and the community wanted to look at, well, what about applying this mixed-use overlay to that township, in addition to the project description we looked at just both Los Olivos and Santa Ynez. And this alternative ultimately would look at shifting 6 units from the Santa Ynez townships and 6 residential units from Los Olivos to the Ballard townships for an additional 12 units. And ultimately, it was concluded that it did not reduce the amount of impacts in those areas related to the mixed use overlay to the extent that it really provided for a viable alternative in that particular area. Other CEQA requirements: population growth, the growth-inducing effects. That's one aspect of every EIR that we need to look at, and we looked at what the project would foster in terms of economic and population growth, or construct additional housing as a result of the policy environment. Ultimately, the proposed community plan with the application of the down zone would increase, we believe, over a 20-year period, roughly 2,100 people. The down zone alternative would lead to 154 people less than the project description. So not a significant amount, but a quantifiable amount that we can put forward for you in the analysis. Other CEQA sections required, as I mentioned before, we believe there'd be over just a little more than 500,000 square feet of commercial growth over a 20-year time horizon. The project description, in our analysis, we believe there would be less square feet because of the predominance of mixed use within those commercial areas. And since the proposed community plan would not increase the amount of commercial development on the 20-year period, we don't believe that it's going to have a significant impact beyond what's allowed on the comprehensive plan today. In terms of precedent-setting action, what action would this have in terms of the overall policy environment? The plan largely maintains the land use and base district zoning in the planning area that's allowed throughout the rest of Santa Barbara County. Certainly, as was done in Los Alamos, we're not proposing any particular zone districts that are just unique to the San Ynez Valley. We are proposing overlays that would be unique to the valley, specifically the mixed-use overlay, but no standalone zone districts by themselves. And certainly the application of the mixed-use overlay and the D-design overlay and the affordable housing overlay are all in themselves used throughout other areas of the county, and certainly we think they're consistent with the other goals that the county has established for the rest of the area. Development of open space and vacant land, residential densities may impact open space or vacant lands. Certainly, those are from viewpoints from public parks and public facilities, but also some areas that are agriculture that some people perceive as being open space. Certainly, those will change over time with the cumulative nature of and build out of the plan. But the plan does not encourage development within the rural areas at an accelerated rate. It simply would allow whatever development that would happen in the rural areas to continue at whatever rate, in the same rate in the San Ynez Community Plan. And the policy environment certainly does incentivize mixed use and infill within the urban areas. Build out under the proposed plan would not substantially differ in terms of the impacts from the comp plan into the San Ynez plan. Again, we think that the plan has beneficial impacts to the built out environment at a 20-year time horizon. Implementation of the policies are expected to offset the demand for some impacts to resources to some degree. And in concert and as a package, and I think this is important to note, is that the overall policy framework and the development standards work as a package to address both the project impacts, but also the cumulative impacts over time. So that largely concludes our presentation today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the next steps. We're, of course, we're going to adjourn today's meeting at the conclusion of public comment to our all-day workshop on Wednesday, May the 13th, beginning at 9 a.m. We have set up the Solvang Veterans Hall to be recorded. We're going to video the meeting, and we're going to televise it, not live, but we're going to tape record the meeting, and we're going to show it on GATV at later dates. That meeting, of course, is devoted all day to public comment, and certainly whatever questions and follow-up items that the commission may have for staff will certainly be prepared to address those comments from the outset. It dawned on me as we began this hearing today that there may be a need, since many people may not have set aside today to come to the meeting, to put this the recording of today's meeting on our website, so they can live stream that on demand. And so we're going to be working with Government Access Television to see if we can do that, put that up on the site right away so that people can listen in to today's presentation so that they're well prepared to see what we covered in anticipation of next week's workshop. So our recommendation, this is going to be the recommendation that we're going to bring back to you at each one of the hearings, is that the Planning Commission recommend that the Board of Supervisors certify the EIR, adopt a resolution approving specific amendments to the Land Use Development Code and the county's comprehensive plan, to adopt the San Ynez Valley Community Plan with the downzone alternative, and that the board, when they receive the Planning Commission's recommendation, adopt the appropriate ordinances amending Chapter 35 of the San Ynez of the county's code, and amending zoning and land use maps for the San Ynez area. With that, that concludes today's staff presentation, and we'd be happy to answer any questions or provide more information as needed.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission? I don't see any, so I think I'll go ahead and, if Commissioner Cooney hand me those slips, we'll go ahead and take public testimony now. Okay, Mr. Johnson was so diligent and organized in his presentation that we'll have no problem, I think, hearing everybody today. But I would ask you to limit your comments to 3 minutes. So, Mr. Ron Kay. He left. Donald Mahoney, excuse me. Malone, Donald Malone.
I can speak at the next meeting.
Great, thank you. Susan Petrovich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. I'd just like to make some overall comments and raise a question that staff may have to come back with. And then at the next hearing, I'd actually like to get into more specific issues. First, I do want to raise an issue about the boundary, the plan boundary. I think that including in a community plan agricultural lands, that is the areas that are outside the inner rural boundary line, invites in the long-range future zone changes that will actually encourage growth in ag lands, because just using the term community plan insinuates that it's a community, it's an urban type use or suburban. And I think that you really need to look carefully at whether or not it's advisable to include our agricultural lands in a community plan. Also ask you to look at that Buellton, I call it the agricultural land bubble. The area north of Buellton along the 101 corridor, it's not really connected with the valley. It's really isolated, and yet we've got this finger of the plan going up and grabbing parcels that I suggest are not appropriate to be within this community plan. I can understand why you'd keep Buellton in because it's one of our major urban centers, but the areas outside Buellton that are ag lands and have traditionally been zoned for agriculture, I think you ought to look more carefully at, particularly as you proceed north along the 101 corridor. And then I'd like to particularly ask some questions about the heritage sites in this proposed downzone alternative. I'm not speaking to the specific sites, but the overall idea that this is really a breach of faith with the landowners who own those sites, who attended hearing after hearing of the GPAC and the VPAC. And the heritage site approach was a compromise between those who wanted immediate downzone and those who wanted no downzone at all on those properties, and so this was a chance for individual landowners to come forward and ultimately apply some creativity and flexibility to the way the development of their site would occur. And it would give the county tremendous future potential for review before it could be developed. There's nothing to say that all of these sites can or will be built out to the maximum that's permitted by zoning, because as the staff noted, the owner has to demonstrate that they've met certain standards. And one of the questions that I would like to raise has to do with slide 119. That's the downzone alternative is described as having no change in the number of residential second units. But then in the staff report, at both pages 7 and 16, and in his oral presentation today, Mr. Johnson said that the downzoning alternative eliminates 111 RSUs. But when you look at that table, it says it's the same with the present zoning, and incidentally, those downzoning sites are primarily heritage sites. So those are the ones that are discussed, and I'm asking the question, how could, the math just didn't make sense to me, so I'm raising that as a question for further response.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Louis Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Planning Commission. I am Willie Chamberlain from the Los Olivos area there in San Ynez Valley. And I would like to point out to you that I probably have the greatest history of particularly agricultural land use planning in the San Ynez Valley. I sat on the GPAC during the 70s, which from there came this current plan that's been used since the very 80s. The finger of 20-acre parcels on the northeastern corner of the valley had already been created. And I submit to you that it's been one of the most superior plans in the county to last for the number of years that it has and not have any more changes that has taken place. What we did, we looked at the individual zoning, particularly which is now called A1 versus A2. We made sure that, and there was no such thing as an interrural boundary line at that point in time. We made sure that those were appropriate throughout the valley. We created the interrural boundary line. I believe it's the only one in the county. And we did that for a very good reason. We did it so the A1 would not expand out into what is now A2 and start to create smaller parcels. I beg you, use the existing plan, please, to which you think about in making any changes. I don't care what they've recommended to you. And if you need to make some tweaks in zoning, so be it. I hope you use the heritage plan and not the downzoning alternative. The downzoning alternative is rotten. But I ask you to look at that, set the interrural boundary line, and then put the community planning line on that line. We should not have any A2 or any AC in the community plan unless it is 100% surrounded, a complete island, and there are 2 or 3 of those islands in the valley. The rest of it, just like Susan Petrovich said, should be left out of the community plan. The reason that it is so good and scenic today is because it's A2 and not A1 and not a community plan. You know, when this process started, the planning boundary line was the high school district, basically. The agricultural community asked you to please bring it in to the interrural boundary line, but we said, hey, create a little room as you look at the plan so you can tweak the interrural boundary line, but then that's what the planning boundary should be. Some people say there's no planning on the ag lands, then the heck there isn't. We still have a comprehensive plan and zoning. We just don't have the community plan, and the community plan does not belong on agriculturally zoned lands. I believe that you have to put it on the A1s in order to connect the cities, the towns. And so I submit to you that I ask you to please do that. Look what we have today. It has worked so darn well, and make the fewest tweaks you can possibly make to make it come out and last into the future. And as Susan Petrovich said, the downzoning is really an insult, particularly if you can do something like the heritage site. And I would like to come back to you next week and show you the boundary line of the urban boundary line of Los Olivos, which is in the wrong place with their proposal. It needs to go above north of 154 to recognize what's there. You're not going to create any more sites, maybe 1 or 2 home sites, but you got to recognize, put the boundary line of zoning where it fits on the land and recognizes the current land use. North Street is the area. And when you go further up Figueroa Mountain Road and you get to the boundary line of what now is interrural, again, there's a lot of places there that need to be brought back in. Why put an 300-acre agricultural parcel into the community plan, which is just going to invite us to serve notice of non-renewal and try to get out and maximize land values? You don't want to do that. And I'm probably trying to convince you to do something that's against my best financial interests. Thank you.
Thank you. Ann G-U-R-S-L-E-Y. Karen Steffen. Sam Cohen.
Good afternoon. My name is Sam Cohen. I work for the San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians. Pleasure to be here today. I only have 3 points today regarding the San Ynez Valley Community Plan, which I'm happy to say I've only been working on since 2006, all right, when I made our first request for SB 18 consultation. And that's the first point, is that, you know, the SB 18 process, which is difficult, unquantified, and absolutely a total mess, actually did work pretty well in this process, I'm proud to say. And I'd like to compliment the staff. We met a number of times. We actually took cultural resource management possibly to the next level, where previously we only looked at actual sites and tried to decide if a site would impact an existing known cultural site. We went to the next step, which is part of the existing county archaeological guidelines, where we looked at whether or not there was a high likelihood of cultural resources being nearby. We even went so far as to do sensitivity mapping, and you know, we appreciate the level of effort that was put into by the long-term planning staff, and I thank you very much, Derek. However, I'm not as pleased with the Affordable Housing Overlay District, all right? This is truly a fix without a need. All right, we all know what RHNHA stands for, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. However, the state says that a discretionary housing overlay does not qualify to meet your RHNHA needs. So now we have an overlay without a purpose. All right, the only thing we are guaranteed to do is burden the neighbors of the Affordable Housing Overlay District. I refer to the new Environmental Impact Report, which I have not had the pleasure of reading in full, and I refer you to 2 pages. 4.4-54 and 4.4-70. The first one, page 54, is Caesars, all right, where you can get your car washed at a fair price. All right? Caesars, this page says that in the cumulative impact analysis, all right, this road, Highway 254, will exceed level of service, LOSD, under the cumulative impact project conditions at Quail Valley and Marcelino Drive and Refugio Road, both under the morning and evening peak hour projections. All right? Page 70 is Sienna Way. This is east of Marcelino Drive. It comes to the same conclusion, all right, that in the cumulative impact and project analysis, you will have in excess of level of service D, all right, for both Quail Valley and Marcelino Drive and Refugio Road. And the only mitigation, all right, for this extra 100 units, all right, 75 units in one project and 25 units in the others, are the following. First, roundabouts. I'm excited. All right. Seconding, widening Highway 246. Well, that's going to happen soon. All right. And third, a bypass route. All right, which has been talked about ad nauseum. All right. So all I want to say to you is the Affordable Housing Overlay District in concept may be a good idea, but in this particular region, it doesn't work. I'm going to reserve my treatment of the reservation. Possibly I'll come back next Wednesday if that's possible, and we can talk again further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Bob Field.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, thank you. I'm going to try to briefly fulfill a role here of providing some history and answer your question, Mr. Chairman, about those affordable housing sites. First, let me say I want to compliment the staff on this presentation to figure out where the real issues are in this plan through those thousands of pages, and then to identify them properly and present them so clearly is just a remarkable accomplishment. I can't congratulate you enough for the quality of that work. And now I have to criticize a small, not criticize, but maybe elaborate on a small point. In terms of design review, Derek mentioned a total acreage that might be covered by the design review. And while that's the right number of parcels and the right total number of acreage, the design review really only covers that which is visible from the public rights of way. So it's some fraction of that, especially when you're along 246 where the land to the south falls away towards the river so quickly. It's only a small percentage of the parcel that's covered. More significantly, Route 154, which is the other major corridor, is already under design review because of the state scenic highway design review requirements. So there is no additional parcels or acreage impacted by design review along 154. So the total impact is really very, very small from the design review. The more important one, I think, is the affordable housing sites. And let me say first, any density greater than 1 unit per acre requires a sewer system. And the only corridor we have in the unincorporated Sandy Ynez Valley that has sewer service runs along Highway 246. It's just a ribbon. It's like a piece of fettuccine laid on your map there. And so it was not possible to put affordable housing anywhere except along that corridor, which brought us straight into the problem of that corridor has traffic problems. So we were stuck. There were no choices available. Now, with regard to E and F, why they came out, F is up there to the east. First of all, they were chosen because there was enough vacant land to be worth considering. You know, it wasn't 1/7 of an acre. F failed the test because of 2 reasons. One, there are some traffic concerns up there. Straight above it, you see a couple of larger brick-shaped parcels. That's the school. And to have school kids walking and crossing streets and the traffic related with that created quite a bit of consternation. But more importantly, there was no good access to public transportation from that site, which was one of the requirements we were looking for. E, which is to the west above Solvang, had 2 fatal problems with it. One is it's currently zoned for agriculture, and the idea of converting agricultural land to high-density urban housing uses was an anathema to most. Secondly, second fatal problem, it is not on the sewer corridor. It would have required a sewer service from the city of Solvang, and we got some, let me say, very clear signals that was not going to be available. So those 2 came off the list for that reason. I would like to note, following Mr. Cohen, the Sandy Ynez Valley, there's a common perception, I think Chairman Blau, you might have mentioned it, about the valley not taking its share of affordable housing, but in actuality, in the last RHNA round, Sandy Ynez got a higher assignment per capita than any place in the county. And we met that requirement without these sites. We met it with second units, with the mixed use work we did requiring that sites be affordable. So we met the RHNA requirement. This is extra, and it was problematic in our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Oh, excuse me.
Mr. Field, could I ask you a question, please? If I
Yes, sir.
may.
Yeah, please.
I know you were chair of VPAC, so as such, you not only participated in a hands-on basis, but also had a grasp of the history of the plan. And I'm curious, I have been curious up to this point as to why such small portion of the valley was subjected to the design overlay. For example, in Toro Canyon Plan, which is my neighborhood, the design overlay was placed over the entire neighborhood because the concern was that good design was of benefit to the entire community. So there's a substantial portion of the Sandy Ynez community, the greater community plan area, that is not going to be subject to any design overlay. What was the thinking of your committee on that?
Yes, sir. Commissioner Cooney, there was quite a bit of discussion at a VPAC meeting about this, and many members of the audience spoke along the lines you did, that we needed substantially more than we have. And I think I don't know if Toro Canyon had the problem, but I never heard the word tin barns used as often in a single conversation as I did during that design review issue. And while there were many that spoke along the lines you did, there's a strong this is the American West, property rights. Don't fix something if it's not broken. Tone to the discussions and to the deliberations of the VPAC. And so where the consensus was, and that's what we were trying to find in the VPAC meetings, was that these travel corridors of 246, 154, and Alamo Pintado were the most critical. We used them the most, the visitors used them the most, and that they cleared the hurdle for, we might have a problem there. But there was really not a consensus to look ahead and try to preempt problems. The case that we don't have this problem, so why are we fixing it? That is pretty much the case on the ground. We don't have a lot of big ugly things out there yet. And so the sense of the people in the room, and it was probably 40 or 50 members of the public, it was a 9-person VPAC. This is sort of where the consensus came out.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Lansing Duncan?
Good afternoon, Chairman Blau, members of the Planning Commission. It's rather ironic for me to be here today, since all the 5 years I was sitting up there, I was waiting for the community plan to get to me. I'm glad I didn't wait. I might beg your patience. It may take me a little bit longer than the 3 minutes. I first wanted to just speak about the GPAC. I served on the San Ynez Valley General Plan Advisory Committee from 1993 through 1995 and from 2001 through 2003. During the intervening 5 years, I served on the County Planning Commission. During the period I served on the GPAC, it was a diverse group of approximately 15 volunteer Valley residents. Many committee members had served for multiple terms and had been originally appointed by various supervisors. Myself, for instance, was originally appointed by Supervisor Chamberlain. And some of those members had served on the GPAC since the 1980 General Plan update. There were business people, there were property owners, some who lived in the city, some who lived in the country. Numerous GPAC members participated in the effort to create the Valley Blueprint, which was a consensus-based document, and then the San Ynez Valley newsletter published by Planning and Development came out, and it served sort of as a factual analysis of the state on the ground, highlighting the issue areas that the GPAC would have to address. In May of 2001, the GPAC began official work on the Valley's first community plan. Up to that point, all comprehensive planning had been done in the context of the general plan of the entire county. And of course, that's where you run into problems, when you first have to put in writing the specifics of how you want to envision the future of the community. It never had really been done in such a detail before. We had more than 32 noticed public meetings to inform the community about these critical issues, solicit public input, and compile recommendations from the committee. These meetings were broadly publicized and held in the community itself. Most were held on Thursday evenings in Solvang or Los Olivos. And I have stacks of documents that my wife has been trying to get me to recycle for years now. So I will try to address any specific questions you might have about how we might have reached a specific point of view. From February through May of 2003, county staff worked to compile the draft document. And then in June of 2003, the GPAC held a series of evening and weekend meetings to inform the public and review the first draft of the plan. We specifically held some of those meetings on weekends, and we took the areas which we thought would be most controversial and held them on the weekend so that members of the public could come. Most of the GPAC recommendations in the part of the plan which still remains in the plan are included in the version of the plan initiated in 2004 and now have become alternative to what is deemed the downzone alternative. The GPAC's recommendations for the community plan were focused on maintaining the valley's rural character while discouraging sprawl and the fragmentation of agricultural resources. So it's not surprising that the environmental impact report found the downzone alternative to be the environmentally superior alternative, consistent with the mandate established by the Board of Supervisors, because there is a specific resolution adopted by the Board of Supervisors which describes how GPACs will act and how they will make their decisions. The GPAC worked to consider first and foremost the broad public interest rather than special interests. I served as chairman of the GPAC during 2002 and 2003, and so I'll attempt to answer what questions you might have. I do want to speak to the issue of what's termed the downzone alternative. When we were looking at this issue in terms of how do we achieve the goals of the plan, downzoning was not first and foremost on our minds. And in fact, that's a term I would not encourage you to use. It's not very descriptive. It's very confusing. And in fact, a news press reporter just the other day in an article sort of reversed the meaning of it and the implications of it simply because it's not very descriptive. Instead, what we chose to do and recommend in a number of areas in the valley was to suggest that we should have less density and to suggest that we would increase the minimum parcel size in order to achieve that goal. So if you think instead of this alternative as the decreasing density alternative, or alternative number 2 as it is numbered, I think people will not only be able to grasp better what it is you're talking about, but you'll have a sort of more objective, neutral term to talk about rather than using the term downzone alternative. We weren't thinking, as we looked at that, as who owns the property. We weren't thinking about, who could gain, who would lose. We were looking at the map and looking at the terrain as we saw it in the valley. And in fact, what you'll see, of course, is that in the great bulk of these areas where we recommended increases in the minimum parcel size, it was lots that were undeveloped and almost universally, not everywhere, but almost universally agriculturally zoned, so that we were obviously discouraging fragmentation of agricultural resources, which is one of the things we wanted to do. And we were creating clear boundaries for those different areas which, in fact, Mr. Chamberlain spoke of. In many cases, we adjusted the boundaries so you would have a clear, simpler, easier to understand boundary. Highway 154, as it occurs now, is a clear, easier to understand boundary for the north of Los Olivos than where the original township was platted in the 1880s. I think that's just a recognition of what you have on the ground now. And part of what we were doing was trying to address the situation the community finds itself in now, not in 1880. And one of the things we also looked at, obviously, was that there are finite resources in terms of our infrastructure and the ability of the county to provide public services. And although at one point we might have thought, well, gosh, yeah, we could do with a couple hundred ranchettes out there. At this point in time, ranchettes are really not needed in the valley. And if we add more ranchettes in the valley, all we do is increase demand for service workers. Service workers don't have adequate housing in the valley already. They have to then drive from other locations. So if you look carefully, you'll see that in many places where we increased the minimum parcel size, it was to avoid future ranchette development that would fragment ag resources. And we instead tried to create simpler boundaries. And if you look at your maps, almost universally, you will see that the recommendation made by the GPAC results in a simpler, clearer map. And I hate to be cruel and inhumane about that, because I know in every case this represents people. But that also suggests the sort of objectivity and the principles that were guiding the GPAC, not personal gain, not who we know, nothing like that. And of course, in many cases, because these parcels are undeveloped already and nobody's using them right now except for agricultural uses, the issue of non-conforming structures really probably isn't that big a deal, not that great a concern. So I'll hope you will take to heart staff's recommendation that I think really is totally honest, candid, and objective, that they're recommending alternative 2 because it achieves the goals of the plan in the best way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's my last speaker slip, unless someone else wishes to speak. You have no more? Thank you. Okay, I'll bring it back to the commission. We're scheduled to continue this hearing to the 13th, thank you, in Solvang. I do have a couple comments for staff, for things that I'd like to make sure we get addressed before that next meeting. You had a discussion about the parking when you've got, or limiting the parking on some of the commercial projects when you're going to have two users that might want to use the property another time. I have great difficulty understanding how that would work since we don't zone property for a particular user. We zone it for a series of users. So I'd have some great concern about how the pizzeria owner and the shoe store owner agree to this arrangement, but then one of them goes out of business, and I don't know how you're going to do that. So I would need a much better example how you're going to accomplish that if I'm going to agree to that. You're going to get back to us on how you notify the owners where there is this decrease in density or whatever you want to call it. And I'm concerned that some of those owners weren't noticed properly, don't really understand what's happened to their property with this plan that we're doing. This issue of creating non-conforming lots, I have great difficulty with. I know you're going to give me a list of how that's going to work. I don't think we should be doing that, but maybe you can show me some maps and better explanation how that occurs. But for what I foresee happening is it was zoned 5 acres, it was zoned 1 acre, now it's zoned 5 acres, and there are different limitations as to what you can build. And I think the best example for me was, and I'm not sure this is the way it works or not, but I have the 2-bedroom, 1-bath house that was built 100 years ago on my 1 acre parcel. It burns down, and you're telling me I can't build but another 2-bedroom, 1-bed house with the same footprint? Well, that's what I heard earlier, and I didn't think that was right because it wouldn't apply to a undeveloped property. But let's make sure that we understand that if we are going to be doing this non-conforming use, exactly what did the owner lose in his ability to develop the property? Did he lose setbacks? Did he lose height? Did he lose footage? What did he lose when that happened? Because for me, I don't have a problem with leaving. If you have a 5 acre parcel now and it's a legal parcel, it can be 5 acres, and the one next door could be 10 acres. That doesn't bother me, but to have the non-conforming 5 acre, 10 acre zoning doesn't make sense to me. I did have a question. I probably can't answer my own question, but we are doing this lesser number of units in the county, and does that adversely affect our RENA numbers? And I'd like you to also answer the question that Mr. Cohen raised relative to an overlay not helping you meet the RENA numbers for affordable housing. The other little concern I have, and you can address this next time too, the only affordable projects, I realize this plan started many, many years ago, but I think we figured out over the past 2 or 3 years that the only affordable housing projects that actually work and are likely to be built in the near future are those that are owned by a nonprofit like the one we just approved a month or so ago, and I know there was one in the city the same way. And I don't see how anything in this plan would allow that to occur. I mean, I can't see where you're going to build 10 extra units in a mixed-use project and they become affordable, low rental housing that's managed the way that we think it should be managed in order for it to be successful. The other issue is I know we have seen, especially in, I think it was Los Olivos, where we have some very new and modern and efficient septic systems that are able to handle more than 1 unit per acre. And that being the case, I'm concerned about Mr. Field's comments that the reason they didn't do this was because they didn't have sewage capacity for it. Well, again, this plan started several years ago. I know we've seen projects in the last month or last few months where you could do very high density commercial projects with multiple bathrooms, and they had systems that would accommodate that. So if that's the case, it puts a different light on what we could do for trying to identify affordable housing units. That's about it for me, although I wouldn't mind seeing a map describing the boundaries that Mr. Chamberlain talked about, just so I could make the comparison. Maybe he'll provide them to you and you can provide them to us, but his comment I thought was interesting, and I think it deserves a little bit of analysis. So those are my questions and comments. Commissioner Palencia, you have some.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, on the affordable sites on 246, were those picked only because of the sewer capacity that's available or probability of capacity?
Chairman Blau and Commissioner Valencia, the criterion that was used that we found in the administrative record was sewer available or adjacent. Water was available as well. There was ability to hook up to a municipal water system and not rely upon a well. Not environmentally sensitive habitat. Likelihood of neighborhood compatibility. No impact to ag land. Likelihood of public acceptance, not in a floodplain, adjacency to city limits, and adjacency to public transportation corridors, and also to other types of uses or services such as schools, healthcare, shopping, etc.
Those are all nice things to have, but I think is the overriding thing the sewer, and are there other sites available that have sewers that where these affordable houses could be placed, or are these the only ones? Are there any lost parcels, any other place within the entire community plan area that have sewers where this could be done?
Chairman Blau and Commissioner Valencia, certainly there's urban areas that are either like these sites that are already underdeveloped or have some development on there that certainly could have the affordable overlay placed upon it, that are within areas that are served by municipal wastewater services.
All right. And, all right, thank you very much.
Just a note to staff here, we need to fix Commissioner Brooks's light. It's so dull I can't hardly see it. That's why I miss you half the time. See that? I can barely
Is
see
that
it. That's
why?
it. Yeah, Commissioner Brooks, you have a question.
Thank you, Chair Blau. I want to thank staff very much, and I want to thank those who have participated for many, many years on the creation of the plan. I am honored. I think that'll be my word for today, that I'm sitting here and that this plan has finally come forward, and I certainly will take my role very seriously because I know the weight of all those hours and all the energy that went into this. It's come to fruition, and it will come to fruition. Let's see. I had some questions about probably in the EIR, the dealings with the Class 1 impacts. There are so many of them, and it seems sometimes, especially with the water, wastewater, biological resources, I'm probably asking if, when we come back on the 13th, that maybe some more specific mitigations. It just seems that there's lists of mitigations, but nothing can be done about it, so let's go on to the next one. I don't know if there's a realistic way of dealing with those, but there's so many, in the document. I would like to see them addressed maybe a little bit more thoroughly, especially having to do with water. Staying with water, in looking over the EIR, there seems to be, every several years we have new studies as far as overdraft. And prior to, was there a water study done in 2002? You mentioned one in 2005, but I believe there was one in 2002, because prior to that there was indications that the valley was in overdraft, and then we had some new definitions of overdraft or equations that came out, and now there supposedly is not a state of overdraft. I'd like to have that maybe looked into, and maybe for my own edification, to know that in fact the valley is not in overdraft by whichever equations we're going to be using. There was a question about the parks, and I found it interesting that when some of the schools in the valley were created, that the schools received some Quimby funds, to help, establish some playing fields. When I think of recreation, in the valley, and I know it's a problem where we live too, it's the idea of soccer fields, playing fields, softball, baseball fields. And I'd kind of like to know a little bit of history of that, how much of the Quimby funds went into the existing school facilities, and if we cannot go, and we don't want to go into agricultural lands, for new fields, what could be done to enhance the properties at the schools so that maybe some of these needs for fields could be addressed. I already mentioned the idea of the bike paths, looking at that as possibly mode of transportation rather than recreation. Mixed use. I grew up in mixed use. I'm from suburban New York. Walked up 3 flights of stairs for many, many years. Stores downstairs, apartments upstairs. I don't see a definition of what the mixed use would look like yet. And my thinking on this is we're looking at affordable housing possibilities. We need housing that's affordable. What I would not want to see in Los Olivos, let's say, are in a mixed-use situation, you have living situations like an upstairs type of thing, you have your commercial space downstairs. I don't want to see any kind of residential, let's say apartments, rentals, that would appear 2 years down the line in vacationrental.com. People renting these, and it happens. It happens in every community. There are hundreds of what I would consider, illegal vacation rentals in the city of Santa Barbara. Go to vacationrentals.com. How do you kind of control this type of thing in a mixed-use definition? And perhaps, again, I might be coming from a different definition of mixed use, but as I said, I see that as residential, kind of second floor, commercial. And is there any way that some of the affordable housing would go into the mixed use? I mean, where I lived, those of us who lived in apartments usually, were from families that couldn't afford some of the beautiful homes in Westchester County, and that was how we dealt with it. And there are concerns. Maybe it's not going to solve all the problems, if people have the concerns about the affordable housing, but doing some kind of tweaking with mixed use and affordable housing. I support preserving the rural character, getting the range of housing, and
I need to caution, this is not deliberations or make a decision. This is really just questions for staff.
Okay.
To bring back to you, thanks.
All right, I'll have more questions next week, probably.
Okay, that's great.
But I do support the philosophy behind open space, the gateways, and the distinct urban communities. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. Commissioner Brown.
Thank you. One question I have is on the affordable housing overlay sites, A and B, which went through the Airport Land Use Commission, and they determined the site would be consistent with the Airport Land Use Plan. If there were, in fact, housing to be built there and there was a project, would that have to go back before the LUC? And there could be a completely different commission, and they could say, no, we don't support it. Is that possible? They could do a turnabout?
Chair Blau, Commissioner Brown, there were specific mitigation measures that were imposed as part of the consistency determination, so it was a conditional determination, and there were mitigations that were imposed specifically related to the footprint of the development and placing the footprint of that development outside of the approach zone. So unless the approach zone were to change, as long as the development envelope is outside that approach zone, I think the Airport Land Use Commission would have a hard time making an inconsistency determination.
Great. Thank you. Commissioner Kim, about ready to conclude unless you have no comments?
Looking forward to next week, Mr. Chair.
Great. Okay. In that case, I believe our meeting is, to continue it. All right. I'll entertain a motion to continue this to the 13th of May.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Jessica, please call the roll.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Commissioner Brown?
Aye.
Commissioner Brooks?
Aye.
Commissioner Valencia?
I think we have a new process. I think Commissioner Brown seconded it.
No, I entertained the motion. She moved it.
Oh. Aye.
Commissioner Blau?
Aye.
Vote carries 5-0.
Thank you all.